Oh my God, Anna, you hadn't seen Dennis's face.
Let me share my screen.
Sure.
Let's see here.
Let me just share the Zoom link once again in our group, just to see if anyone else is joining. Oh shit. Share the wrong thing. I see you went back to a regular slide presentation after all those Blackboard presentations you've been.
Yeah, I gave up on that
Perfect.
for this time. It's just too much. Plus, it's kind of hard to visualize some of this stuff. Definitely need an artist's help or something to add here. But on the other hand, I do have a demo, right? I've been spending some time working on this Badu simulator program that I mentioned in a previous meeting. So hopefully that'll take the place of visual aids. Okay, I think we can start since we're recording, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So for this presentation, we're going to talk about some of the topics we've floated around in the past, but I wanted to put it on a more secure footing. And I invite, conversation here because these are things that we've been working on for a while now, but they're not always explicit. And some members of STP have pointed this out, like, why aren't we systematizing things or making things more explicit? And that also, I think, facilitates the conversation you two were just having about asking questions and not passing things over in silence. So this is my effort to try to connect the formal side of what we do in STP with kind of the metapolitical, philosophical side of things. So here's what we will be talking about. Reflections on STP and where I see formalism fitting in there. Trying to motivate it some more so it doesn't seem like the math is just a secondary thing, but has a real place in all the other things we're doing. And this will require that we do a brief introduction to logic. I say brief, but it's actually going to be like half of the presentation. It's going to be the main thing. And then once we have this notion of what logic is, then we can move on to this text by Vickers called Locales and Toposes as Spaces. And a lot of this will be kind of recapitulating some of the things that Yasha had presented either last year or was it a year before on space and logic. So definitely after this meeting, I encourage everyone to see that presentation also if you want to know more, or talk to us in WhatsApp. I know we've been talking about doing like a separate math meeting. I think this would be a good topic to cover there, and I don't think I'm not going to be able to cover like even 1/3 of the text by Vickers, but even the first 1/3 is enough, I think, to like really connect the dots for us, because there's a lot of things that we have been doing that utilize this stuff, but we don't really know what it means, right? So the monster diagram, for example, is, in my view, a set of toposes and the geometric morphisms between them. But that kind of statement, we don't currently have the technology to back that up. Well, all we have right now is kind of a speculative, like, this is where we'd like to go. But hopefully this presentation gets us there a little further. Also, I'm open to being wrong about that too. Like, we could be totally wrong. This is not even based in logic or not in the mathematical logic that I'm presenting here. So that's also something to consider. I think if John Bova is here, he has a presentation coming up. Hopefully some of the things here in this presentation also tie in with things he'll present, because I know he has a lot of knowledge about set theory and the issues that Badiou has been studying or investigating in immanence of truths. I think there's a lot of ways we can go with this once we have a firm grasp of logic. Okay, but before we get to that math stuff, let's talk about metapolitics, right? This is things that we've talked about before, but I think it's really important for STP especially. So metapolitics is not the same as politics, right? What we do in STP in our research programs, when we talk about politics, we are not doing politics. We are making comments about politics from outside, right? Usually from a philosophical angle. And I don't know if everyone agrees with that, but that's how I see it. And that's how we've, talked about in the past, but it was never really explicit, right? So what is metapolitics? We can break it up into two related statements by this French guy Lazarou. First thing is politics thinks. So when you're doing politics, you're already thinking, right? The thinking is the politics. And let me see if I can adjust this a little bit. When you're talking about the results of politics, the way that politics makes certain things appear in the world, you're doing metapolitics, right? So there's a sequence that happens, there's a movement, there's people doing things, organizing, and then we, from the outside, we see the results of that, and that gives us, fuel for thinking or raw material for thinking something. But this something is not the same as the organizing that has already happened, right? And the second statement is thought is a relation of the real, which I interpret that to mean that thought has to have real consequences. So in the case of the first statement, politics thinks, there must be consequences to what doing politics is, right? In some sense, in some register. Something is changing, something is not possible after, and some things are now possible that were not possible before. That's roughly what a consequence is. So this division between kind of there's a division between the types of consequences that metapolitical thinking has versus political thinking, right? Both are forms of thought. Therefore, both must have some consequences. I think for Badiou, this division roughly corresponds to the one between body and subject, right? So there are consequences on the body, which is not just an individual body, although it includes that. It also involves larger bodies, right? Organizational bodies. And the consequences of metapolitics has more to do with metaphysics, more to do with, thought more broadly conceived, maybe independent of any of the truth procedures, right? We don't have to worry about that, but there's a division there. And then I gave an example here, in mathematics, you have a proof that has a body and it has consequences, right? But those consequences are, they can have consequences on other proofs that can happen in mathematics. So once you establish a proof of a statement in mathematics, you can use that in other proofs. And then in the overall metaphysics of the subject, you can then look at this procedure of mathematics and make some statements, but those statements aren't mathematical, right? So they don't have consequences on math. itself. So this is roughly how I view this metapolitics, right? And then you could sum up both of those statements with this last one, that politics as a form of thought delimits the field of political consequences. So when we talk about politics, we are simultaneously talking about what we consider to be political consequences, right? That is an open question. What is a political consequence? But as you delimit that, as you define the boundaries of that field, you are defining boundaries of politics. Okay, so all that is to say that we have a measuring stick for when, or we're after a measuring stick for when we are actually thinking politically. This measuring stick has to do with this idea of political consequences. So from that, I wanted to propose this thesis, which again, we've talked about before, but I wanted to maybe make it kind of a formal statement, that there exists this thing called a political membrane, which is kind of like a layer that separates politics from metapolitics. And it kind of like, you know, in the cellular world or in you know, the natural world, this membrane prevents certain consequences from happening in politics from metapolitics. So like you make a statement in metapolitics and you're like, okay, now I'm going to take that into my organizing work. I'm going to try to make it into some kind of principle for organizing. There's something that blocks that from happening, right? And I think that's an interesting phenomenon, right? That's interesting that statements we make here in STP, for example, don't necessarily translate into actual organizing practice. I think this is something we're really interested in because, you know, as in STP, we also have been talking about working with other organizations. We have met with other organizations, and it's always kind of a difficult moment, right? Because everything we've been working on these past few years, we're kind of faced in that moment with like, okay, now how does this actually help others? So let's put that problem aside for now. Like that is a problem, but I also wanted to point out that metapolitics has other uses besides serving politics, right? They help us individually, and I think we should be honest about that when we come to STP and we are discussing these things. We're getting something, each of us individually, from this practice of doing metapolitics, right? And I put these things here, like they help us to cognitively map the world. So understanding the world, it might seem like nothing, but it's, you know, it's huge. Like it's really useful for us. It helps us work with other people. It gets us more interested in actually doing other things like political things. It helps us not to go crazy. It, you know, serves as a pretext to connect ourselves to other people. And so all of that is not really politics, but you could say it's like a precursor, right? It could be a precursor because if we're crazy, we can't really do politics. If we don't have a clear picture of the world as individuals, probably not going to be working with other people very well. So, yeah, that's the point of this metapolitical membrane. But these two other points I wanted to make is, you can use a metapolitical statement politically, but in this case, something like a political context is necessary. It's more context sensitive, right? So a statement like, you know, politics, it means building a non-principal ultrafilter, right? We've made that crazy statement before. That has no political weight on its own. You have to do something to it to make it active. And going back to this statement in the previous slide, it has to have political consequences, right? So what is the consequence of saying that politics is building the non-principal ultra filter, or what is the consequence of saying like there is such thing as a monster diagram that describes the different modes, and there's this thing called org, which is seeing simultaneously all these different sites of struggle. Like we haven't really figured that out. What are the political consequences? So because we leave that open, right? We don't, that's not our goal, to find political consequences per se. So because of that, yeah, some extra thing has to happen, right, to cross this membrane. And then the second caveat here is that things can easily cross the membrane, but that doesn't mean that has a consequence. So again, we can make memes, and memes can make it into politics, but that you have to really define what it means to have a consequence there in order for this to really make sense, right? Okay, this is a long-winded way of saying they're not the same thing. There's this membrane. Okay, so let's move on to SDP. So we are a para-academic group that studies its own political membrane. That's interesting because we're obviously interested in politics. We do research, and up until recently, our main case study has been ourselves, right? We look at everyone's research. Everyone here has their own line of research, and we said, okay, how do we organize ourselves in such a way that we can create space for everyone here to pursue what they're interested in? That's a constraint, right? It means that one person can't just be talking all the time. It means that there's certain work that needs to happen for one research project to inform another one. And it also means that not everyone can follow what's going on in SDP because there's just too many different lines of thought happening at once. These are all challenges we have that inform the way we organize. So when I say that we study our own political membrane, we're thinking about how the research that we do crosses into how we organize. One recent statement that someone here made was, online relations are not social relations, meaning online debates don't pass the political membrane. This is metapolitical, right? This isn't something that stops people from having online debates. And you can disagree with it. It's not like axiomatic here, but one observation that I'm making is that many of us know each other offline, and we've had 100+ meetings together, working in this way now for quite some time. And when we disagree, right, we're not all on the same page all the time. I don't think we all hold the same political standings or beliefs. We're not all allied to the same sets of movements, or at least we are pretty vague on our commitments usually, politically. So I think there's something there. Like we have some set of relationships that keep us together when our commitments diverge. So I think that's what I mean by saying that we're studying our own political membrane. We are trying to figure this out, like this thing that's gluing us together right now, that's bringing us to work together, and it has to withstand this disagreement. And maybe it won't always be that way, right? That's also a possibility. Maybe at some point our orientation differences might become so strong that it would pull apart the group. And there's nothing that says that won't happen, right? So we're in a very experimental phase. I see it happening in 2 phases, which may kind of repeat, right? We're always going either phase 1 or phase 2, but maybe maybe each one of us is in a different one of these phases. So phase one is the individual research is what gives the constraints for how we organize. So our research projects become the environment. And I think this was especially true at the beginning of STP. We had very little in terms of rules and things we had to do, right? Work that we had to do to organize. We just said, okay, just show up on Mondays and do, and you know, this is still true for a lot of us, like just show up, listen. We don't ask, we try to keep the ask to a minimum of what you should do besides that. And then phase two would be, okay, now some people in the group are doing some organizational work. They're scheduling things for other people. They're writing notes on other people's presentations. They're, you know, there's work happening outside of the Monday meeting. This should come back maybe to our research, right? I mean, if we're really studying our political membrane, that reverse movement is happening. So maybe in that sense, you know, phase one and phase two are like two sides of this membrane, right? For metapolitics going into politics would be like our research, our individual research going into how we organize, and then how we organize going back into metapolitics would be phase two. Right, so that would be actually maybe a exception to this rule about the membrane thesis, right? That one doesn't have a consequence on the other. Maybe there is a way, but I think it would be an exception because STP is one of those groups that focuses on their own membrane. Yeah, it may not be true for like STP studying some other organization, right? Things we say here may not affect some other group, but I think we may affect ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's how you hacked your own thesis, because if to go from metapolitics to politics, you need political context. If you restrict the political context to only refer to the group's membrane, then you've contextualized the consequences. Then it becomes,
yes,
right. I think the reflexive aspect of that is what made it. I mean, it's just.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting. We don't really know how it works with us. There is some context there that we all have, that we're maybe not fully explicitly relying on. And it's related to this, also this like network of relationships we're forming as well outside of the group. Yeah, and these other points here, yeah, not every encounter between STP and some other philosopher is consequential, right? We have a few things like references that we're using. Cartani, for example, that had some consequences here. Like Cartani is making metapolitical comments. Now, because we are reading him and we use him, it translated into an organizational issue at least once, which is when we were writing the atlas together. When we wrote the atlas together, we used Cartani's work as a way of binding all of our individual writings. So in some small way, it made that project possible, right? Again, not really as a theory, because it's not like we all agreed exactly on what we were doing. We didn't all agree on what Cartani was saying, or at least, you know, we never made a big debate about, you know, if we did agree or not. We just kind of glued ourselves to this object that, you know, it had a consequence on us without us fully knowing what it was. Okay, so that opens up that last question, which is, okay, we have this political membrane and we're seeing things get through. So how do we tune this membrane? Like, can we make it sensitive to some pieces of information? Some metapolitical pieces of information can cross and others cannot. or some political activities can then inform the research, but others won't. Yeah, so how do we tune that, right? That's the open question here. And I think that becomes more important the more we talk to other organizations, because depending on how our membrane is tuned, it might change the way that we communicate to others, and what forms of interaction we have. Okay, so this is kind of the broad stakes of what we're doing, I think. So then let's look at some metapolitical statements that we've made. I've kind of grouped them by the projects we worked on together. And they're not, obviously it's not a complete list. I just chose some by like skimming each of these texts. But around the time of the primer, which is this text that we wrote really early on in STP, I think in late 2020, we had this idea that impersonal domination requires a theory of impersonal emancipation. This is also, we're using this again, right, with the world systems theory text. That's a metapolitical statement, right? It doesn't necessarily have a consequence on anything in politics, but it's a comment about how politics could be done, right? We also said, economies are large organizations, political groups are small economies, so we need a common framework to talk about them together. They're not just separate things, right? This idea that political economy itself is phenomenological, what does that mean? It's something vaguely about like analyzing it as a composite of logical content, right? Logical statements that build on each other, that have to do with phenomena that are objective, they're independent of a subject, of a knowing subject. Social synthesis can be modeled as sheepification. It's a horrible sentence to say. That's another almost politically inconsequential statement, but again, for our personal edification, I think it's nice, right? You do get a sense of like, okay, now I understand something. If you know what a sheaf is, and you've read like Sonrethel, or you've considered social synthesis before, if you can connect those two things, it does seem to make things less obscure. I don't know, maybe that's just me personally, but I think there was a benefit in that statement, but it wasn't political. And okay, I'll just go more quickly through these. So yeah, around the time of the other text we wrote, contribution to the critique of political organization, we had this idea of social mediation, enhancing individual sensibility. We had this idea that if you could lose some social information at one scale to make yourself more effective at another. And then this statement I said at the beginning, the non-principal ultrafilter, that somehow we're, in order to achieve emancipation in politics, like you're building this thing that kind of ignores all predicates, right? Or exceeds predication. Then we have the atlas. I already mentioned monster diagram, but then also like metapolitics is itself a subfield of techtology. And so we have this kind of addendum we made to Bogdanov, which is like, can we separate techtology into these three groups: compositionality, intelligibility, and interaction? So three separate fields of study of metapolitics. So we can, it might be possible to take these metapolitical statements we're making, all these statements here, and we can group them into one of these three, or maybe, it touches all three. But it's a way to like kind of refract these statements we're making. And then this is our latest iteration, right? So we wrote this text called Working Through Political Organization. Now we're working on another text on the logic of social worlds. In between that text and this text, here are some things that we came up with. So vulgarization, I'm translating that to saying that there's political membranes everywhere, right? This membrane issue is not just between metapolitics and politics, but it's between different groups, different languages. And so this problem is more general than just like, how do you get metapolitical statements to matter? It also means like, how do you get political statements in one group to be translated into another one, right? How do the interactions happen? Yeah, peripherization is kind of a thesis on time. It's saying like, as time passes, you have more incoherence. You need to rely on hybrid forms, because you can't take for granted that the space is connected enough that your statements will be heard the same everywhere. And there's different sets of rules that you have to obey as you move across social space, right? So this is what we're kind of calling in our latest text social space-time, right? Not the working through political organization, but in this text we're currently writing, social space-time has these kind of two properties, right? It tends to vulgarize itself and it tends to peripheralize. And that has impacts on politics. But this, being careful here, we're not saying that our theory has consequences, right? That again violates the membrane thesis. We're saying that we are observing that this phenomena is having consequences on politics. So these are some of the consequences. You have saturation, which says that the kind of progressive optimism that used to sustain leftist movements is no longer helpful. It's actually counterproductive, because it starts to seem like it ignores the actuality of this process of vulgarization and peripherization. If you're ignoring it, if you're pretending it doesn't exist, then you are making statements that have less and less effect, and even a negative effect, because people don't trust you, right? Because you're acting like everything's still heading in a good direction. Endogenous reproduction says that the tendencies of the left are decoupled from actual reproductive forces or political forces. So you're not really thinking, because you're not having consequences anymore, right? You're kind of repeating old slogans. You're reproducing yourself as a leftist rather than sticking to actual like social constraints, right? And this is connected to the whole online thing. Like, online relations are not social relations, right? So you can reproduce yourself as an online leftist, for example, without ever really like engaging with the actual problems on the ground. Multiplicity thesis says that there's no essence to the left now. Like, that's actually something we should accept. It's a positive thing. You can still find common ground with groups, but it's more of a case-by-case thing. It's not, you can't just rely on, Marxism, Leninism or something like that to be a common point that everyone can look at. And then the organizational standpoint says that within disorganization, there might be new forms of organization that we just don't understand. We don't have the sensibility for it yet. And if that's true, then that has further consequences, right? That means we can act as if this is true, even. And that maybe will enable new statements to be made, new forms of organizing, new forms of interaction. If you give up this idea that there's some kind of common essence to what the left is doing, if that you need a certain amount of agreement, for example, to work with someone else. If you suspend that for a moment, what is left over? That's the kind of speculative wager of all this. And then on top of that, you have this metapolitical project, which SDP is engaged in, which is, okay, so now if we hold all these things to be true, is there an idea of a framework that can encompass all these statements? And this framework should also be able to make new statements that are compatible with these, with this theory here. Okay, so that is the preamble of Metapolitics, and I want to use that as a jumping off point for talking about formalism. So our formalism should follow from the metapolitical framework, right? There's some things we're committed to, these statements here, but they're not very well defined, right? We ought to be able to formalize them. We ought to be able to make them into like statements that have some kind of implication structure. Otherwise, we're just making pronouncements and not really ever checking if they're consistent, if they're accessible, like understandable. How do we know that the meaning or the truth of these statements is not just in our heads, and then other people who come join us, they're like, what are you saying? You're just saying like nonsense right now. In order to show that it's kind of has some basis, I think we ought to go towards formalism. It's not the only thing we need to do, but it's one direction, right? So what are the constraints of this? I think it needs to be general enough to satisfy the metapolitical statements, right? So whatever formalism we come up with, it should be strong enough where all these statements can kind of live together. If at some point we make a framework that can capture a subset of these, it's still useful. It doesn't not necessarily, one framework doesn't have to cover everything. So maybe what I should have said here is like frameworks plural, right? Maybe put this, right? But yeah, there's some question of generality here, like how general do we want to be? What is the common language of all these different statements we're making? They could be very different, very different statements to the point where there's no way we could unify them. Renzo, did you have a question?
Yeah, sort of. I was just wondering whether does it make sense to, because I feel that the initial metapolitical what do you call it, like metapolitical statements at the beginning, they were quite general, like the Badiou's and sorry, I have a flu, so I'm not thinking that well, but and then the ones that we have in the text, like that you've just passed through, I feel that they are a bit stronger in the sense that they're already, to me, they feel like more like axioms, like they are propositions that have they affirm a certain political idea, and if you follow it, certain like phenomena become legible, like the political consequence, saturation, multiplicity, etc., becomes legible once you accept this more like political, I don't know how to call it, but like this political axioms, which feels something stronger than Lazarus and Badiou's sort of like general metapolitical. So I wonder if these sort of axioms they live in the sort of membrane you're talking about. Like if they are able to make new phenomena legible, then they are political axioms. Otherwise, they're just like, I don't know, theory or like some theoretical concept.
Yeah, I definitely agree that it's more specific. I think that doesn't necessarily mean that they're political statements. I think they become political statements when you actually, make some kind of organizational decisions based on these things. But yeah, I think we're kind of doing that. Like of all the statements we're making, these ones probably have the most effectiveness on our day-to-day organizing in STP. Like the way that we, you know, good examples, like we did this interview, right? With Barnes, or we, you know, we're talking to the Vienna students, like that. I think that follows from these statements more. But yeah, I'm not sure if they've totally crossed the membrane. Gabriel, you have something to add there?
Yeah, I think that one way that clarifies the similarity between them, even though they have forms that are more determinate and others are more general, some seem to have to do with the definition of metapolitics, others seems to have to do with particular metapolitical statements. What I think they all have in common, and that I think it's another way of considering this division you're proposing, is that usually the things we say, they tend to open more space for politics. Like you should, once you consider that you cannot count on progressive optimism, you're not saying what you can count on, you're just saying what you cannot. Or when you say that, you know, there is no guaranteed common ground, it just means that you cannot assert beforehand what the common ground could be. So I have the impression metapolitics has a lot to do. The reason why it's not consequential in the sense that political statements are, is that the consequences are more of the field of allowing there to be political consequences. So that's why it's metapolitical. So the consequence of these statements is that you feel like you know less, and now you need to actually engage with stuff if you want to have more prescriptive or specific political consequences and evaluation. So from that perspective, that metapolitics is about, let's say, having less assumptions about political life without just not saying anything, right? I think that what qualifies metapolitics is this very particular paradox of having a determinate theory that keeps things indeterminate, right? So you want to be on a certain side, thinking certain things that require you to state them. They're not obvious, evident, they're not going to be given, so you need to state them. But you're stating these things in such a way that you're not over-determining how political life happens in specific contexts. So that's kind of the paradox that you're in. But from that perspective, I think the big statements, such as there is a distinction between politics and metapolitics, it is different to leave things indeterminate so that we can check them on the ground, and to actually check things on the ground. There is a distinction there. That statement and the specific statements that do this for specific issues, like there is no such thing, you cannot count on the unity of movement. There is something like in ecology. You cannot count on the unity of a common social ground. You need to check this contextually. All of these things are like regionalizing actual political statements and requiring you to actually explain where you are, what you're engaged with, so that proper political statements now can have a reference, right? So my impression is that that's the underlying distinction. Metapolitics is about emptying out presuppositions, and political statements about actually checking positions rather than presuppositions, right? So
yeah.
When you take it from that position, I think that the division that Renzo mentioned, it exists, but it's less qualitative. Like it's all these theses. It's weird because vulgarization, peripherization looks like strong sociological theses about the destiny of the world, but that's not really needed, right? You can still think of them as, you know, I think that's the difference between the teleological version of peripherization. The world tends towards social incoherence because something is happening, and the more metapolitical thesis of peripherization, which is saying the from the very definition of peripheral space, it is the most general. So if it is not the case, you need to show, right? If you do have a common ground for a struggle that is given in your place, well, good for you, but probably it's a regional or local statements that should be evaluated politically and not through some theory of history, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not sure if that helps, but it's just how I approach this difference, like between emptying out and things that can be contextually verified.
Yeah. I think there are two sides of this thing I said here, which is politics as a form of thought delimits the field of political consequences. I think metapolitics also does that in a sense. I mean, it also delimits something, but it doesn't. It's almost in the opposite direction, right? It removes limits that were previously maybe taken as an assumption, and I still feel like maybe it's more for the individual. Like, metapolitics can have a real consequence on you personally in terms of things that you look for, things that you think are politically relevant. Like if you hold all these, you hold all these to be true, the vulgarization and so on, then you personally will probably look to join or look to be a part of groups that, that look a certain way. But then once you're in that group and you all kind of agree that all these things are true, then I think real politics kind of starts from there. And I think that's what Gabriel was saying, the work of checking. That's what I'm calling like political work. Otherwise you're still kind of on the membrane itself. Maybe the membrane itself has a thickness, and within that thickness you have like these very close to the ground statements that you can then turn into like a hypothesis that that you can actually check about the world. Anna, did you have something?
Yeah, so I think this is just a great, I just want to mark this space. I think it's a really great sort of way to sort of transition into the discussion about alignment and misalignment, I guess, more in the future as well. Because like I strongly agree with like everything that Gabrielle was just saying about the periphery being the more general case, and like the sort of peripherization process and misalignment being kind of almost more like the default, and like that's sort of a in a way a basic metapolitical thesis, so according to the sort of concept of metapolitics that's being developed here. I think that's all really wonderful. I guess the one thing that I think I would like to interrogate a little more is that I kind of feel like, okay, like you have to show that there's alignment, you have to check for it and like show it, right? I honestly would tend to argue that I don't think you will ever find alignment if you actually check for it. And like I'm not convinced that you can find alignment anywhere. That I think that the idea that there is alignment, or the attempt to show that there is alignment in some sense, is sort of always that process of like covering over misalignment from the beginning, which is a much stronger thesis. Like I'm aware that's a much stronger thesis. And I think you could argue that also sort of needs to be shown or like worked out in a little more depth in some way. But I do think it has really significant implications for like the flow of these kinds of arguments, and like the way that even concepts like metapolitics and politics are knitted together. So I kind of did just want to mark that space for like to note that this is a conversation that I would like to have about like that topic, and like what was sort of coming up in like some of the discussions about the text that we're working on that I feel like I didn't really communicate very well before. So I just wanted to make that statement.
Yeah, I think that's great. A great point. I think, like first, how do we check that? Like, how do we even check if something is aligned or misaligned? That's a question, and I think that's probably going to lead to different political decisions, right? Depending on where you are in the world, what that means. And then, we're an international group, so then like, is there some problem of translation there between alignment in, for example, the United States versus alignment in Brazil? Like all those things start to come into play, and like ultimately we have to ask, what is the like consequence of deciding that to be true for an actual organization? Like how do we behave differently if we know this about our environment? Because it's one thing to say that, okay, I verified that everything around me is misaligned, but then what is that, how does that change how I'm supposed to act? So I think that's a great point of where this question or this problematic starts to matter. And so, yeah, and I think that also leads into the next point, which is like formalism is important because to even try to attack these problems in a principled way, we have to kind of agree on some things, right? We have to agree on some definitions, or at least, have some way to check ourselves, right? When we say checking, there's checking in the form of like investigating, like being on the ground investigating. There's also checking in the sense of like, are these terms clear enough for everyone? Before we like set out to look for them. So I think that's where kind of we can motivate ourselves. So I already went through the first thing. It needs to be general enough. Formalism also needs to be productive. So if we have a set of statements, it'd be nice if our formalism could produce new interesting statements, right? Not just answer the old things, but if we really, if we really study it, maybe that implies like one statement would imply the other statement. And then that's also something like a new hypothesis can emerge from that formalism. And then it's preferably accessible, right? This isn't exactly a hard requirement, but I think if we wanted to actually bind us like the monster diagram did with the atlas, or any future writing projects we have, there needs to be some work done to build the staircase to get to that formalism, which also like, there's maybe this perception that some of us know more than others, and maybe that's true, but also like that's something to be tested and checked also, because it's not just like a given, right? And so I think there's a process there that we're just starting to discuss, like how do we not only make new advances in the framework, but also make the existing framework clear to everyone and clear to ourselves, right? The people who work the most on the framework might be also very confused by it. I think, talking to Alex in the last, or the time before last, when he presented the Dreamy Cats, clearly there's like a whole nother level of mathematical sophistication that he brings, and others, who interact with us. There is some work there to connect that to what we're doing, and to even evaluate like where that fits in. And then finally, so we want it to be grounded in mathematics, right? Because I think that actually satisfies all three of the previous things. Mathematics is general, it is productive, and it is accessible to an extent, right? Because obviously you have to study and so on, but there's enough resources online, and there's enough between us, I think, like just all of us studying on our own, to make it accessible, right? It just takes work on our part. So definitely we need to leverage this, but we're not experts. We need help from the math community. People like Alex, would be great to invite them to work with us more. And then finally, this basic thing, like what do we mean by logic and phenomenological? Let's like really iron that down, because I see that as very foundational to our metapolitics, metapolitical statements. So when I say foundational, I mean this picture here in this next slide. So the way I see currently how formalism works with everything we've been doing is that it kind of serves as like a basis. Not that you need to know about it before interacting or doing anything else, right? There are all these blocks here are independent. You can study each one of them and make great contributions, and it's like so many open questions in each of these things that we'll probably never get to all of those questions. But what I mean by foundational is that I see formalism kind of like running in parallel to each of these things, right? All the statements in each of these blocks have some kind of formal analog, some construction that captures something about the thing on the right. So this is only like a subset of constructions, but like I believe in logics of worlds, if you understand sheaves and complete hiding algebra valued sets, you're going to understand logics of worlds better, right? And that's Badiou's wager. That's why he spent half of the book talking about these things. And I believe if you understand memory evolutive systems, you're going to understand technology better, right? Because it captures some of the things that Bogdanov was thinking about, as far as like a general science of organizations. And then, yeah, if you understand modalities or maybe logic more generally, you might be able to analyze world systems better. You know, when in the current text, we talk about social synthesis in Sonrethel's case. I think that also kind of falls in here, like, what does it mean to synthesize or compose social bodies together? There's some mathematical analog of that. And then finally, yeah, we saw with Alex's presentation, Dreamy Cats, that might be a good formalism to capture certain phenomena in capital, right? Even though it's like way more complex and probably overpowered for certain questions. Like it could be a good environment or productive environment for analyzing these questions. So yeah, there's something to be gained from taking statements from things on the right and moving them to the left. Anna, do you have another question?
Yeah, so I'm really curious, like, the way that you put capital on the top thing there with the sets through time, operas, Dreamy Cats thing, making reference to Alex's presentation. This is maybe a really hard question that I shouldn't ask right now, but it kind of makes me think, like, so if we're thinking about the analysis of capital as being maybe like a metapolitical operation, like taking like some of what Cordella's arguments about capital are that I presented on as a point of departure, I was kind of thinking, like, would it make sense then to say, like, if the analysis of like the political consequences of capital is like more metapolitical, is like Cordella's idea of the in itself for itself as like, on the one hand, capital is surplus value, but on the other hand, also like labor power as like potentiality or whatever, would that be sort of more like in like the specifically political space? Because I feel like it's sort of like, it would really help me to better understand like the place of like some of the theoretical project that I've been trying to bring to the table. If like there's a way to kind of distinguish, like, on the one hand, how that kind of surplus or like potentiality, which I think it's true that, Alex's framework is a lot better suited for capturing the sort of more like, I don't know the right word for this exactly, but kind of like detemporalized sort of formalisms. I don't know, I guess I'm just kind of trying to sort through that a little bit, because I feel like part of the disconnect with some of what I've been bringing to the table is that it is like a little bit less metapolitical and like a little bit more political. But then I guess the question is, like, are there operations with that kind of like those sorts of political projects that then could sort of be folded back over into that space, like the viable system model, for example? Like, that's not capital, right? But it could be analyzed with the terms that Alex was laying down in that presentation, right? So I mean, we can do that explicitly. So like, I don't know, I guess I'm just sort of like kind of questioning, like, is there a reason to privilege capital as a concept for like that layer of things? Or, is that sort of just like the maybe central kind of metapolitical issue that we're dealing with, because capital is like the dominant, the K or W or however we're abbreviating it of in the monster diagram for the social space?
Yeah, there's a lot there. I think I'm viewing all of this as like way outside of the membrane. So like it's all way in the metapolitical, like the top right portion of this. It's not anywhere near politics yet, or, nothing we've produced here necessarily is going to pierce through that membrane, right? I think, yeah, maybe if like, you know, you were to like, I don't know, form a group that was like super into VSM, for example, and you know, were, you know, organizing people around that idea, then yeah, you could, you know, make a case for replacing capital with like something else, and then, you know, trying to produce statements that you could then, you know, build something on the other side of the membrane. But I think that's a separate problem, right? That's like, I don't think there's anything necessarily political about the statement that like there's a potentiality in that is ignored by capital. Like, I definitely agree with that. I definitely agree that capital ignores like the potential of labor more generally, or people in general, but that statement itself, like you have to do something to turn that into a political statement, I think. Right, because again, there has to be a consequence to it. And what is, you cannot say what the consequence is from outside, right? You have to be within some kind of movement. You have to attach yourself to something in order to say if something is consequential or not. And so from right now where I'm standing, like I'm not making any statements that are attached to any given movement. SDP, besides SDP itself, right? SDP itself may have consequences, and you know, if we say like, if we adopt Cordella's framework over Marx's framework or whatever, that might have some effects on how we organize within our group. But I think it's still an open question, like if that is true. I don't know if that answered the question. Gabriel, do you have an add-on to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something because I have the impression, I mean, perhaps Anna could tell us what she understood from the difference between metapolitics and politics, because I have the impression, I got the same feeling as you. I didn't understand why Cordella's discussion of for itself in itself and potentialities, how those were political statements. For the sake of clarification, the sort of thing that I feel like it's a good, because the membrane idea, I think it captures something nice, but I think it's a kind of fragile metaphor. It's very spatialized. It makes it think like you can just move from one thing to the other when, like my understanding that a really good way of checking these things, it's a bit disconcerting, but it's a good way. And I think it also clarifies what mathematics can bring to the table is that a good distinction between philosophy, metapolitics, and politics is how wrong can you be and how can you find out if you're wrong. So if you're trying to organize, it's political consequences that tell you if you're right or wrong. You know, if you're increasing equality amongst concrete people in a concrete place, however big it is or whatever, well, you must be doing something interesting, right? Whereas with philosophy, because you're not addressing specific people, you're addressing everyone in this kind of abstract sense, you can only extract verification of whether you're right or not by what we call kind of reason or whatever, right? You're not on the trial of political consequences, you're on the trial of proving that there are any consequences. So it's already doing a lot for philosophy if you can show that saying something implies you cannot say something else, because saying that being is one and that being is nothing, and saying both things at the same time, nothing really prevents you. So putting yourself in a position where you're not allowed to say everything, right? There is this nice idea that a system is consistent if it shows that some statements become impossible, you know? You cannot say everything. So it's very hard for philosophers to actually manage to show that they cannot say everything. In metapolitics, we're both trying to stay a bit closer to the field. You know, we're trying to make as many statements as possible about the need to verify statements in politics. So we're not saying what the consequences are, but we're saying, you know, we should approach politics in such a way that most things need to be verified in concrete struggle. But then the question is, what can we rely on to show that we're not, that there are costs to what we say, there are consequences, and if there are consequences, you can say one thing, but you cannot say another. That's where the formal grammar helps, because it's a grammar that if you say one thing, it's pretty easy to know what things you cannot say, right? So it gives you a cost measure for statements, and sometimes that's something missing, and that it can help us distinguish if we're speculating too much, or if we have a common agreement on the costs of things. So that's kind of where I see a kind of, when I lose track of this distinction, that helps me. Like, okay, there is philosophy where in some sense it's very hard to show you cannot say something. You can pretty much say everything, and what will prove you wrong? You know, metapolitics, it seems like you make good statements when they increase the level of freedom for politics, right? But then you need to make sure that these statements themselves have some consequence of their own, like in the sense of coherence, right? And then there are political statements which we should be able to almost name the people who can either prove them right or wrong, because they're ultimately addressing concrete people somewhere, right? We hope that somewhere can be very big, but we can also think we're saying something political, but it's just said in such a complicated way that it's not producing any consequences. So that's my take on this. But I wonder if perhaps I'm approaching this differently from how Anna is approaching, because for me, Cordella would fit the same field where we're talking about, and would still be up for discussion. How much it opens space for this situated consequential statements, and how much it is on a field that it's hard to know what it is that once you say that thing, you cannot say that other thing, you know?
So if I could respond to that, I guess in general, I think this actually might also help to clarify some of the debate over like JP was bringing up about whether like the communist I think you can argue, the idea of the communist hypothesis that like, that org is bigger than K or whatever, like, is that a political statement or a metapolitical statement, right? Is that something that has to have like political consequences before you can really make it, or that can count as a thought? With respect to the Cordella thing, for me, what's really important about what she does and like what I like about her, what I read into her work, which like I think it can be read in several different ways, but this is how I do it, is that, I mean, she aligns herself with anti-philosophy. Like, she calls herself a non-anti-philosopher because she sees her project of like, anti-philosophical critique as like even sort of including and being bigger than philosophy in some sense, right? But I mean, the point that I see from that then is like, she devotes so much of her writing specifically to really polemicizing or critiquing certain positions, precisely because she thinks that, they have objectionable political consequences. And that, the question for her is like the extent to which you're able to, sort of discursively commit to some kind of imminence, right? Has consequences. It has political consequences, it has, sort of psychic consequences of various kinds. So I'm like, I don't know, I read her from that perspective of like everything that you say and do in like a philosophical, discursive level that isn't necessarily formalized. Like formalisms help a lot in like many different ways for like, bringing the consequences onto the level of like the communicative level itself, rather than just sort of like a more like, I guess, singular kind of like, oh, like I am experiencing this and like this implies this, rather than like, oh, the statement itself implies something, right? Like there is a distinction to be made there. I just think that even without the formalisms, even within this sort of like, more general like philosophical approach, you can evaluate by consequences, you can pay attention to consequences, and you can see how every statement has some kind of consequence that can then sort of be fed back into it to change what you can and can't say. And like that's sort of why I tend to read Cordella from like what I do think is sort of like a more political perspective. Like as an organizer, like I try to think about, the ways that my ideological commitments might sort of fail to be sufficient to the political situation, because they're not taking account of some aspect of the situation that, if I apply, I mean, in a way it's similar to what the whole idea of like the principle of like maximalism or whatever, which has actually been a theme in SDP. And like there's been a little bit of discussion about that. I don't think actually, at least sort of the objections I've raised before, were really to the concept of maximalism, but almost sort of to the scope or to like the position that like I think you would put it in. Like I'm not sure that it really is.
What is maximalism again? Is it because
So I know Dennis could probably speak to this a little more, but like the idea of like I'm trying to remember the specific formulation. It's in the Atlas of Experimental Politics for sure. I'm not, I think it might have been Reza's section. I'm not totally sure. Or Dennis's. I'm not sure. One that Dennis wrote. And there's a similar formulation in Contribution to Critique of Political Organization. Off the top of my head, I don't want to like misquote it. So maybe Dennis could help, but like there was sort of this this idea of like commitment to maximizing possibilities of some kind. That was sort of a thread that was in the text, which is what I'm referring to.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly what it was. It had something to do with like, yeah, like if you have some measurement of like ways of organizing, then you want to maximize that, then that's like kind of a good thing. That's kind of a, ultimately that fits with our idea of political ecology, that you build these connections and then you increase the space of possible connections. But I think, yeah, again, the problem here is like, if it's true what you're saying, Anna, that everything could have a potential consequence in politics, then it must also be true that it's possible anything can have no consequence, right? Like among the possible consequences that you can have is no consequence. So now if you accept that, then you are faced with the question of how to tell one from the other. Like it's kind of like, if everything matters, then it's possible nothing matters, because you don't have a lens to distinguish the two necessarily. And constructing that lens or constructing that sensible membrane, that is important, right? I think every political group is always constructing that, whether they know it or not. They're building a membrane that is filtering some things out and allowing some things to come in, right? So and it's based on like concrete issues. Like if you're hungry, you're not thinking about these academic debates. That's not going to pass your membrane, because you're worried about food, you're worried about shelter, like that's what I mean by membrane. Like it's just something that automatically is going to block some statements from ever impacting you. So I think we're just trying to be specific. Like I like this maximalizing perspective, but I also wouldn't go into any organizational space and claim that maximizing thing is a good principle to be used by them, right? By a specific group of people. They might just look at me like I'm crazy, and I might just like discredit myself out the gate by saying like, let's do org maximalism, guys. Like that's then that's what I mean. Like that's a membrane issue.
So, I mean, I agree with that. And I think that's exactly why formalisms are so helpful and why I'm so invested in STP's project of using them, because like, that's precisely how you can sort of, I guess, distinguish between this one level. I guess I'm thinking of more in terms of like singularity or whatever, where it's kind of like, there's sort of the everything, nothing coincidence, and like there are all sorts of consequences, and no consequence is itself a consequence. Like, I feel like this is sort of the level of like, I mean, it's almost kind of phenomenological or like meta phenomenological in Cordella's language, that like, it's not, because it's not making these distinctions, it's sort of just about how you're reacting to appearance in some sense, that it's like, you're just working with some kind of underlying like experience or like subjectivity on some level, singular subjectivity on some level. But of course, that is a position that like in the sort of strict like Wittgensteinian sense can be nonsense, right? For any given language game, any given like sort of social space or like particular sort of discursive formation. I don't know exactly what the right world maybe it's like the more STP word. But yeah, like I feel like it's sort of like I just sort of see both, I guess, as important on a certain level. Also because like if you're able to sort of, bring that subjective standpoint in as you're sort of working with the like objective sort of phenomenology and the formalisms that like STP works on, like from my perspective, I'm not going to go into a political situation and say, hey, let's do org maximalism. This is sort of why I like the anthropology of the name stuff and like lots of stuff there. It's like I'll listen to what are the ways that people are talking about it with what they're doing, right? And then I'll think about, okay, well, maybe it's not literally just this kind of org maximalism principle, but what are the closest things that I'm getting from these sorts of conversations that like I could contribute in some way to kind of expanding the horizon of raising the level of potentiality of this process or this organization or whatever. You're not going to want to say it in a specific way that you had that thought if it's not, your world or your language game, right? But like there's a version of it for them too, right?
Yeah.
So like that's sort of what I find useful about that kind of thinking. Is like why I also emphasize this idea of translation, that like so much of like political and metapolitical processes are kind of oriented towards these sorts of like organizational translation between different worlds of some kind. And like I think that's a lot of what the monster diagram is about too, right? Is like looking at points of like sort of disjunction and conjunction between these different like worldings in some sense.
Yeah, I think that's the crucial part, the step you mentioned of listening and figuring out what is the language that's being spoken before you speak and before you, like introduce your ideas. I think that's where all the difference is, like that figuring out what that is. Like that's where I wrote here, metapolitics can help us get interested in doing politics and work with other people. But in the actual course of working with them, there is this extra work of like, listening and not trying to do a, kind of a condescending thing where you just kind of bring your own ideas and say like, well, everything you guys are doing, it just fits under this thing that I've read about. You have to kind of respect the process of the process itself is the thinking, right? This is what the statement means, right? Politics as a form of thought delimits the field of political consequences, meaning what is to be consequential will emerge in the course of the organizing or the meeting that's happening. It's not something that you brought. And I'm trying to make this distinction, like we have a measuring stick. We each have our individual measuring sticks of what we think is really cool, really consequential, really important. But we have to suspend that measuring stick when we enter into a space with other people. Otherwise, we're not really working together, right? In order to work together, there has to be some room for some new type of measurement to occur. That's not something that we think in our heads. And that's where the membrane comes into play. But yeah, it may very well be that everything that we do in our individual lives has some consequence politically, but from an epistemological standpoint, like there's no way to know if that's true. And it's even if we could know that, it wouldn't help us with other people, I think, because when you're with other people, you have to consider this other dimension that's not just like you knowing something or even all of you together knowing something. It involves this like suspension of the individual. Gabriel.
Yeah, I just want also to try to get back to what you were kind of on the way to present. I also think that perhaps probably, I mean, I know we're doing like a mixed presentation where we're presenting and we're debating, but probably we could like take a break soon just so you're not like straight to the end with no pause. But just on this, I think also trying to return to the main topic, my impression, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the discussion is going to a direction that I think it's fine, but nothing will, we're just gonna agree to disagree on it or whatever, because it's just too broad. Whereas my impression is that what I take from what you're saying is the inverse. I think that it's when you define like metapolitics separated from politics, and you do this little diagram here with little fields of mathematics that go with some of the ideas we've had, I think it's a way of restricting, like showing that, you know, metapolitics has nothing to do with mathematics. Like it's a political problem, and the meta is not going to come from category theory or going to come from, you know, it's not like politics plus formalism and then becomes politics becoming metapolitics. It's not that claim. Metapolitics is still just a kind of a bunch of propositions that can be made in any format, right? They have the form of the propositions you showed. None of them were formal propositions. Yeah. But then there is a challenge. And I think this is the challenge that we face. And it is in at the level of this challenge that the formalism, the three properties you stated, makes the formalism pragmatically interesting. Nothing to do with very profound issues, in fact, which is, if we were engaged in the same political struggle, I would have a bunch of criteria to know if we're in it together, if we're constructing something together or not. When we're trying to stitch together many different political processes, many different political positions, because and I think that the maximizing thesis only goes this far. It's just a very simple way of claiming, don't assume you know what is real political thinking and not. It's just a humility thesis. Assume that the more, like, in doubt, assume that people think politically, even if you don't understand it. So assume the most amount of thinking people as you can. That's just it. It's not like push towards richness of organization, no matter the context. That doesn't make sense because it's such a context-specific thing. So it's just saying, like, it's a kind of a humility principle about people are doing politics in a way that makes sense in that context. We should accept that. If that's the case, then what is going to be our criteria for knowing how to operate if we're not in the same political struggle, right? In the same political struggle, I have similar goals to you guys. I know how to assess if we're going the same direction or not. The moment that we move to this kind of secondary level of, let's try to integrate as many political processes as possible, we also lose track of a good criteria, a positive criteria for what is, you know, how do we accumulate ideas that fit together? And it's because of this lack of criteria that formal language is a good device, because it is like, you know, finding for yourself a kind of a pattern or a certain, like a language with a grammar. So you have well-formed statements and not well-formed statements. Some well-formed statements lead to others and some don't, right? So suddenly we gain a criteria for concatenating our ideas together. It's not the only criteria, but in the lack of, you know, such a strong ground, we need as many ways as we can. But it's a very pragmatic thing. Like, well, the more we can add, like in the little pyramid Dennis drew, the more we can move between, you know, Bogdanov, Badiou, Karatani, Marx, you know, Stanford Beer, Lazarus, our own experiences, and find a common language to put them in, the more resources we have to see if we can accumulate ideas together, given that we don't share a political struggle as a goal that can give us a clear criteria for what is, you know, going in the same direction and what is not going in the same direction. So I would separate those things and give it just a pragmatic kind of color to it. Like, politics comes with that: concrete people, concrete places, and concrete goals. The moment that you want to mix together a lot of political processes, what you gain in generality and kind of overview of things, you lose in having this concrete criteria in your hand. And then you need like a grammar, or you need some strategy to concatenate ideas together, because we don't want to trust just our personal opinions or the humor in the week as our criteria for joining things, or if we're mentioning the same authors, or if things like this. So what can we use that will give us some workable criteria for accumulating results? And I think that's the moment where making this jump to formalisms, and the fact that they are productive, meaning they produce new statements, they're accessible in the sense that they don't belong to anyone as a language, and they're general enough to accommodate many different ideas. That's when the pragmatic value of these virtues appears, right? I don't think we need to assume anything about what exists, about the value of formalisms in politics. None of that is necessary as an agreement for us to pragmatically agree that these are useful tools in lack of these common concrete goals to measure if we're accumulating or not accumulating interesting results together. So I don't know, I think that there is a presentation of this argument which makes sense to me, but that it's, rather than pushing the formalism to it as an explanatory feature of what politics and metapolitics are, it actually is a restriction. It follows pragmatically from the distinction, right? If politics requires concrete consequence, concrete addresses, concrete situations, and so on, and metapolitics is the combination or the wandering through or the recognition of as many political processes as we can, it also means we cannot have a concrete political criteria. And then we need to find other criteria, right? And we try to find them. I know two flavors of criteria we have in S2P. Equality in organization, that's a criteria, to give people space to present, to see if people get other people involved in what they're doing. Connections, that's a criteria. And finding a common grammar, it's a mix of concepts, formalisms, and examples, right? All those things mixed together. It's a work in progress, but I think that's where the formalism, like in practice, that's where it's been appearing. Like, I don't think we demand or we need commitments that these things have like a more profound kind of value than that. They do have a more profound value in the field where they are being developed, but that's not where we are, right?
So, I mean, yeah, if I could just say, like, I don't want to spend too much time on this. Like, I do want to get back to the presentation, but it's really fast. Like I kind of brought up in like the chat about the world systems sort of space-time text. I feel like this is sort of like a point where there does have to be a little bit of agreement to disagree, and like a lot of it does come down to like you bring up grammars and like sort of whether things make sense. I think it is really about the like distinctions between like sense and nonsense and like grammaticality and grammaticality, like all that fun Wittgenstein stuff. I think a lot of it comes back to that, and like that's fine. I don't really want to push it too much, but I think it is sort of worth highlighting it as like a point of and something that does have a bearing on at least my participation in these conversations. But like I think we probably should get back to the presentation.
Could you just write on the chat here, just so we don't get in the way of Dennis? Like I lost what you meant, like the Wittgensteinian, like the word I couldn't hear it properly. Like it has a bearing on the Wittgenstein's something, and it just cut off for me a bit. I couldn't hear it.
Oh, just like sense, nonsense, grammaticality, ungrammaticality, like what's a language, what's not, that kind of thing.
Yeah, maybe let's take a break for 5 minutes. I need to step away for a second anyway, but we can discuss in chat, and then I can move on to the next part when we get back.
Sure.
Okay.
You know, while Dennis is away and we're waiting, if you're there and you want to explain what you mean, because
I'm putting it in the chat.
yeah, I mean, again, I understand what you're saying here, but I understand that you put more emphasis on pattern than rules, but you put more emphasis because you're interested in that, or you're saying that this argument invalidates the thing that was said about using formalism as something that helps us find criteria for if we're accumulating results, because you can have a different preference of line of work, approach, but it's, I think those are two, I'm just unclear on the type of statement that you're suggesting. Wittgenstein, Karatani, Kristeva, are they undoing something?
No, I don't think it invalidates anything exactly. The point I'm kind of just trying to make is that I think it's politically relevant, but I'm trying to get a better sense of, like, you know, is it metapolitically irrelevant? And I kind of get the sense that, like, I'm trying to figure out the extent to which this sort of, like, emphasis and this sort of work is something that sort of does need to be more rigorously separated from metapolitics and metapolitical projects, even if it does make sense in some other register to, like, bring it into questions of, like, politics and political organization.
Yeah, but for example, so, like, I think a good way of going in that direction would be to understand when you say, I think that the patterns can be put to work politically. Okay, if you agree that politics has to do, you know, with something that is a little more situated, that involves, like, perhaps we could name movements, we could name challenges that they face. Do you think we could have that discussion in terms of examples like that? Like, what is the type of situation that involves, let's say, an interest in patterns more than rules, and that you think, like, this is a good example of a place where this challenge is appearing, and having a bit of that sensibility to patterns rather than just worrying about rules or whatever could perhaps open a new kind of approach to it. Like, do you have something like that in mind that we could use?
Actually,
Like
I mean,
what?
yeah, like, I kind of, it's very indirect, but, like, this is, like, you know, a lot of my experience with feminist politics, like, where I come from. Like, you know, I mean, I, you know, grew up in, like, a bunch of feminist consciousness raising groups here in Philly, and, like, how a lot of that ended up translating into the sort of more, like, socialist politicized work, and a lot of the issues with, you know, dealing with things like gender politics, dealing with, like, how you know, the orientation that these organized sort of political groups have towards different forms of enjoyment, like problems related also to, like, you know, sexual harassment and assault policies, all sorts of stuff like this. Like, I think, like, how enjoyment is organized, how patterns are organized, rather than necessarily how we think about them in terms of rules, has important and concrete political consequences. And, like, I mean, there's sort of a reason why, like, a lot of my interest in this comes out of, like, my history of engagement with feminism and, like, feminist theory, as well as, like, feminist, like, concrete feminist organization. And, like, that's sort of where a lot of it really is oriented. I'm used to kind of separating that a little bit from, like, how I talk about it in theory spaces, which is maybe not ideal, but that is sort of a lot of
I just, as a kind of alternative, like, feedback on it, like, I think it would be much easier to follow, just at least start from where you're starting, so we can kind of ascend with you towards all the mediations, like conceptual, because, like, you just provided a scaffold with at least 4 steps, right? Feminist challenges, for example, dealing with assault and things like this. Then you enter with a second level, which concerns the idea of enjoyment, which I understand you're taking from psychoanalysis. Then you associated enjoyment to the distinction between pattern and rule. Like, I work with psychoanalysis, I've never seen, like, that's a new idea. So when you, on top of all of this, say, well, we should, you know, focus on patterns, they have political relevance. Like, from the like snapshot of that statement, I didn't know you meant that, you know, like, which is really cool. Like, it's an important idea to discuss this sort of challenges, political challenges, but there are, like, it's a very complicated scaffold to unpack from the surface level, you know? like pattern and rules, we should focus more on patterns. Patterns have something to do with enjoyment. Enjoyment is at stake in certain challenges we find and that you have experience on in your political life in feminist circles. Like I get that core thing is political, but it's just like a feedback in the sense of I'm just perhaps too stupid to follow some stuff, or I haven't read up on it, but it's not clear to me that scaffolding was implied, you know?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. It's something that I will try to work on more in the future. I guess it's partially comes out of sort of, just negative experiences I've had in the past with trying to directly bring up like the concrete political problems. And like how easily that can devolve into kind of like conversations that often feel like they're not getting anywhere, or people feel like attacked in ways that I, try to avoid. But it seems like the approach that I end up taking, which is like working with theory at this very high level of abstraction, oftentimes kind of creates similar problems or different problems that also are, issues. So I'll try to work on making it more directly related to the concrete stuff. But there are reasons and like I guess concerns I have about that too.
I totally get it. It's just because I just don't want you to feel like it's not, there is no desire to follow what you're saying. It's just because like once you now unpacked it, there are like a lot of stuff, and again, as I was saying, it's just sometimes hard to tell from the surface level, if what you're saying is, look, I'm interested in these things and I would also like to explore them. Or if you're because if you are also interested in exploring this, we could find more spaces to deal with it. Or if it's like an obstacle or a objection to the thing being stated, that there is like a use for the stuff that Dennis wants to present today in the context of these metapolitical statements and so on. Like at the level of generality, it's hard to tell the two things apart. Like, let's focus on some other things as well. And yeah, but that would invalidate something I'm interested in. So we would need to revise what you're saying, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I was, like I sort of said before, I'm just kind of interested in getting a better sense of the politics, metapolitics distinction as it has a bearing on some of these issues. And I don't want to derail the presentation too much, but that was sort of why I thought it might be relevant to bring some of it up. And I think there has been some helpful progress made in this conversation, hopefully, but I think we should try to get back.
Yeah,
Are you back?
I think this conversation is exactly the kind of thing that I think we need to focus on, but later, right? Not in this presentation and per se, but in STP in general, because like I said, like we all have our own. Every group has its own like membrane. I think we're kind of still figuring out where that is and what this problem of tuning that I put somewhere here, down here, like what gets through, what gets filtered out. And can we tune the membrane? I think that's very relevant to issues of inclusivity, or issues of what types of people and what kinds of interests are allowed into the group. So yeah, let me resume the formalism part of things, which is going to be the hopefully not too boring, but definitely more dense part of this presentation. So starting with this idea that topoi or toposes, however you want to say it, that is this very abstract general structure for describing mathematical objects, right? And we're going to get into why it's such a interesting or nice environment for things. Because it has to do with logic. Behind all of these things that we're seeing on the left here, like sets through time, modalities, memory evolutive systems, underlying all of them are some set of logical statements that work together to allow you to say certain things and not allow you to say other things. That can all be captured in a spatial way with the Topos framework. So whenever you see like logical statements, you should think like space portions of space. So that's kind of the overall gist of things, right? Trying to relate space and logic together. And I think that's really, powerful for us because again, we're coming after this theory of social space-time. We use space in other ways, like previously we were really interested in the problem of scaling and zooming in, zooming out resolutions, like that's all kind of in the realm of space. So I think this particular idea of a topos is very rich, right? Very dense in consequences for our metapolitical framework. And like Gabriel was saying, formalism is not a prerequisite for doing metapolitics. It's a kind of almost like a side project, right? It's like it would be nice to have this going on as well as making these statements, because that, I foresee a moment when we have so many of these statements and we don't really know what to do with them. Like, how do we categorize them? How do we hook them up together? Like, I think that's where toposes come in. It's more like a very good accounting system for all of these different ideas we're coming up with. Much like, when we moved to WhatsApp, when we started using like WhatsApp groups to organize our conversations, right? I think toposes are kind of like that for metapolitical statements. They're kind of like the WhatsApp group. For each set of statements, you can find a WhatsApp group to put them into, and then you can have a conversation in that language. And you can make sure that things that you say in one WhatsApp group don't pollute or don't mess up the other groups. That's kind of like vaguely how I see the use of this right now. Okay, so now let's get to the fun part, which is set theory. We have to do some of this legwork here because the idea of logic really doesn't make sense unless we connect sets to logic first, and then we'll move on to categories. So okay, so some of you may be already familiar with set theory, but let's and I'm not an expert. Definitely interrupt me with anything that I'm missing. A lot of this is just like what I remember plus Wikipedia plus and CatLab. So we have famously we have Cantor's work on set theory. He's the founder, the creator of set theory. He applied this notion of set theory to very hard problems that no one could really even imagine or formulate before he came up with this framework. So definitely when we talk about like consequences, he was like one of the most consequential mathematicians of all time in terms of like creating new fields and new questions to be asked, right? At the fundamental level of mathematics. So some of these consequences, finding out that the reals are uncountable, what does that mean? They can't be put into correspondence with natural numbers. So that implies there's actually multiple infinities, and there's a way to get from one infinity to the other, right? But they're not isomorphic, so you can't go back. Continuum hypothesis states that there is no set with the cardinality between the naturals and the reals. That's like the specific one. There's more generalized one. So this set of problems is what Cantor was focused on, but the output of that was this whole framework, right? And it led to all these things which eventually will feed into what I'm talking about with toposes and logic. So okay, a set is a collection of things with elements, right? The things are called elements. Elements belong to the set. The term belonging, we should try to empty out what that means, right? Your first intuition might be to say like it's within some kind of container or something, but it doesn't need to be that way, especially when we get to like topos and stuff. They're in categories in general. There's like a formulation of this in category theory, which totally gets rid of this idea of belonging. Von Neumann added this nice addendum, like we can actually think of the elements themselves is just sets, so it's sets all the way down to the empty set. The set doesn't have to share any properties. That's one of the cool things about it. You can just kind of arbitrarily put a bunch of things together and say that's a set. But in the case you want to get things which share a property, meaning you want to do things with these sets, right? You have this thing called the comprehension principle. It's very powerful, lets you basically create a set if you can formulate in a language the property that you want in common, right? So like, in ordinary language, I might say, I want the set of all honest people. Like how do you tell what that property is? Like, what is honesty? How do you define it, right? In the formal language, you have to be specific. You have to specify what are the symbols and implicative structure necessary to formulate such a property. If you can do that, then you're allowed to produce a set with those elements, right? In the first iteration, Cantor's iteration, right, there was no real, and also Frege, right? There was no real need to restrict this, right? Comprehension was just like something taken for granted. Then Russell came along and said, okay, well, what if, I define my property to be does not contain itself, and then okay, the resulting set that I create of all the things that don't contain themselves, does that set itself contain itself, right? Okay, so he's kind of being smart ass, really, but very, very consequential also for everyone, because now you have all these different axiom systems. ZFC is most familiar because that's what a lot of mathematicians rely on. Also, that's what Badiou uses. There's also MBG, which is von Neumann, Bernays, and Gödel, I think. That was an interesting solution to the problem because it proposed this notion of classes, and a class basically kind of creates a firewall between the comprehension principle and like large sets of things, collections of things, which are called classes. So you can't comprehend over classes, although there's probably extensions where you can do that, and then you have to make some other adjustments to prevent the Russell's paradox. But that's not, that's a side comment. You have new foundations, which I don't know anything really about. Type theory, which Russell and Whitehead created. And then you have many others, right? All ways to try to get around this paradox. We'll focus on these two axioms, that there's an axiom of separation in ZFC, and there's also an axiom of foundation. Separation lets you say, like, if you want to comprehend over something, meaning you want to form a set with things of the same property, you have to take those things from another set. You can't just summon from the void like the set of all things with this property. You have to say, I want the set of all things with this property from this other set. So that kind of, if you combine that with the axiom of well-foundedness or foundation, then you kind of protect yourself from Russell's paradox. And then there's other strategies, right? But they're all kind of like, yeah, they're all just kind of ways of safeguarding people like Russell from making these smart-ass comments, right? Really, I'm not even sure, most of these axioms, they're not like invoked in day-to-day mathematical work, except maybe the axiom of choice. That's like the one exception. That's one thing that gets used all the time. I guess you could say like power sets and unions are used all the time. I think those are axioms, but most notably, like the axiom of choice is kind of an important one. Okay, so hopefully that condenses like this idea of sets for you, the history of it. So now we want to talk about relations on sets. So this is a really important idea. You can basically multiply sets together, right? So if I have a set of 3 elements, 1, 2, 3, and I multiply that set S with itself, then my elements become pairs of elements, one from each of the 2 sets. In this case, S is the same, so S times S. So 1 would be an element, right? Because 1 comes from both of them. So a relation is a subset of this. One type of relation is, a subset of the power set of S by S. So if we think of S by S as all possible pairs, right? A subset of that would be sum of the possible pairs. And that subset of possible pairs, we say every element in that is related to the thing on the left is related to the thing on the right. So 1 is related to 1, 1 is related to 2, 3 is related to 3. That's what we mean by relation. And relations can be n-ary, meaning we can do this as many times as we want. We can multiply S by S by S by S by S to create a relation of, length n. And then there are these other properties to relations. They can be reflexive, meaning X is related to itself. Symmetric, meaning if you have X related to Y, then Y must be related to X. So there must exist in this subset of the power set of S to the n, there must exist the opposite of the relation. So if you have 1, 2, then you must also have 2, 1 in the same relation. Transitive, X related to Y and Y related to Z implies X related to Z. If you have all 3 of these, you have an equivalence relation, and therefore you can partition your set. Equivalence relations basically behave like equality for all intents and purposes. It means that a chunk of your set, they are all related, mutually related, and you're either inside that group or you're not, right? Yeah. So forgive the, if you're a mathematician, the use of the word group is off limits here. You can't say group, but yeah, by basically sections of this the set, right? So you've partitioned out this set into different classes, basically. So that's going to be useful later on. I gave an example here of quotienting a set by a relation. So given a relation such as the multiples of a number X, I can get a new set back, which is basically condenses all the elements into a single element of this resulting quotient set. In this case, the resulting set would be like the prime numbers, right? If X is greater than 1, then you'd have one element be all the multiples of 2. You'd have another element be all the multiples of 3, and so on, right? And that is obviously another infinite set. We can basically say like, okay, that's represented by the prime numbers. So it's kind of an interesting thing you can do, right? Okay, that's everything we need to know about set theory for now. Now let's move on to propositional logic. So invented by the Stoics, not by Aristotle, though they're related, I guess. Same time period. Propositional language consists of symbols called atoms. When we talk about social atoms, like we should really be thinking about this. This is going to get a little more complex later, but it comes from logic, right? Atoms are these very basic building blocks of your language. They are denoted by letters, and you can form sentences with them. The way you form sentences, well, an atom by itself already is a sentence. But if you want to make more complex sentences, you need to use these connectives. So you have negation, conjunction, disjunction, implication by implication. Negation is unary, so it only takes one. You can only put one term after it, one letter. But the other ones are binary, right? So conjunction, disjunction, you can put one on either side. So A and B, or A or B, right? Conjunction is and disjunction is or. So yeah, you use these to form these sentences. We call them formula, right now. Actually they're not sentences yet. So that's actually there's a important distinction between formulas and sentences, which we'll get to. So for right now, an L formula is either atomic or it's a combination of atoms and connectives and parentheses. So here's one, right? Here's a formula. It's not yet a sentence, but it's a formula. And then we can take that formula and we can view it as a tree. So if you look on the right here, you can see why we call the bottom layer atoms, right? They're just like single letters. And then we ignore the true and the false for now. We combine them using the connectives, and then we get the thing at the top, which is the formula itself, right? So once we have this formula, we actually don't know if it's true or false, right? We don't know the value of the formula. So that's where assignments come in. An L assignment is a mapping of every atom to either true or false, right? And this is true for Boolean logic. So P, Q, QR, like you see this assignment at the bottom. If you think about it for a second, you'll realize if you assign true or false to the atoms, then you automatically can tell the truth or falsity of any sentences which use those atoms. Like they percolate upwards, right? So for every L assignment, you also get an L valuation. The valuation is a mapping of every formula to either true or false. Okay. And then if you look at, I won't spend too much time on this because I assume a lot of you have seen something like this. But please stop me if it's going too quickly or I skipped over something. So now that we understand what valuations are, we can talk about the set of formulas which are satisfiable, right? That is a set of formula which there must exist an assignment such that the valuation of every formula is true. So if I have some assignment of these atoms, let's say there's 10 atoms, right? And I have like 5 sentences that I've made out of these 10 atoms. Well, if I can find a valuation, meaning assignment of true or false to these atoms, if I can find one such that all my 5 sentences are true, then that means that set of sentences is satisfiable. Okay. So that's important. Because not every sentence you make is necessarily satisfiable, right? Or it's not mutually satisfiable with other sentences. For example, if I say P and not P, then there's no way, if those are 2 different sentences, P and not P, then they cannot be mutually satisfied, right? Because if I assign true to P, then the other one becomes false. So they have to all be true to be satisfiable. Yeah, and this is a very cool theorem, the compactness theorem. It says that let's assume S is this infinite but countable set of formulas. If you can show me that every finite subset of S is satisfiable, then S as a whole, even though it's infinite, is satisfiable. That's interesting, right? So you have these properties of infinite sets already kind of baked into this. Okay, so now if B is true under the same valuation which satisfies S, then B is a consequence of S. That means it follows whenever S is true, B is true, right? So B must follow S. And then if that goes both ways, right? If S was also a consequence of B, you have by implication, which is this symbol here. A is a consequence of B and B is a consequence of A, also called logical equivalence. Also going to be really important when we get to Lindenbaum algebras, which will be in a few slides. Okay, and so far we've been talking about propositional logic, right? Propositional logic is probably the most basic logic we're dealing with right now. It's actually not strong enough to really formulate set theory, the axioms of set theory. We need to enhance propositional logic with some extra stuff, and that's that's where we get to first order logic or predicate calculus, developed independently by Frege and Pierce. We're now going to move to this other setting, retaining some of the same ideas. A language L now consists of predicates, variables, and quantifiers. Before they just consisted of these variables, or symbols called atoms, right? Now we're going to have these variables and predicates and quantifiers, but the price we have to pay by adding these things in is we also need some domain over which they're defined. So let's talk about predicates first. Predicates are basically n-ary. They're written like this. They're basically symbols, but they take other symbols inside of them, right? And they tell you whether that's true or false. So so here we have a predicate. It takes X, Y, and Z where those are variables. And those variables, obviously, they have a domain from which they're drawn from. We also have quantifiers for all, and there exists. I think it's pretty straightforward. It's just like saying, it's a statement. Must be true over the entire domain, or there must be at least one element in the domain that satisfies it. And then, very much like propositional logic, you can build sentences with connectives. Now, instead of atoms, which are just symbols, we have atomic predicates. So again, they range over some domain. But essentially, they function the same way, right? This is interesting because, potentially there could be multiple elements inside of your domain that satisfy a unary predicate. Even though we call it an atom, meaning it's the most basic thing, it's not necessarily just one thing, right? It's a set of things. Right? If you recall in the previous slides about the comprehension principle, we can build from our domain set, the set of all things that satisfy the property A of X, for example. And that's now what functions as an atom. Okay, so yeah, I kind of skipped ahead by talking about this domain U, but essentially, yeah, like since we're talking about variables, quantifiers, and predicates, and so on, we need to have some set of things from which they draw from. So for all X means for all X in U, this domain set, which can be as big or small as we need it to be. And then here's an example, right? So for all X, there exists a Y. Remember, these are things inside of U, such that not Y and Z implies X, right? In this case, X and Y are bound variables because they exist in these quantifiers. So in some sense, they are forced to be, they're forced to pull from U in a specific way. They're bound to U in a specific way, whereas Z is not bound to U, meaning we can actually think of this as like a set of sentences. For every element we want in Z of U, we could make a new version of this sentence, right? That is kind of a side note, but yeah. So basically, as a free variable, you're actually kind of creating multiple sentences out of one. So yeah, we substitute a variable, yeah, with an element of U. So that's another operation. Earlier I said, okay, formulas are different from sentences, right? Formulas are not sentences. In order to make a sentence, you have to have a formula with no free variables. So in some sense, like you don't have, and sentences are things that you can say are true or false, right? You can give them some valuation. So if you have only these formulas, like you don't have enough yet to really make a evaluation of them. Okay, so that's the importance of defining sentences. Now we want to extend this even further, right? We want to define models, but right now we're not going to call them models. We'll call them L structures. So an L structure M is the domain that we were talking about previously. So it's the set of things that you pull from to populate your variables with. We're going to add onto that a set of relations, one for every predicate in L. So remember, remember this definition, right? A relation is a subset of u times, however many times. If it's, a 3-array relation or a binary relation, it's like either 3, this u appears either 3 times or 2 times. So an example would be like Adam, Eve, Cain is an element of the 3-array relation f of m. Like, let's say f means like family, right? So these 3 are family. They're not the only family in this relation. There's many others. We would say here that it's an equivalence relation because if I'm your family, then you're my family, right? It's symmetric. I am my own family, and it's transitive. So if I'm family of someone and someone is family of someone else, then I'm family with someone else. So here, so so like these relations are one-to-one with predicates. Okay, so that also means, remember that we moved from atoms to atomic components over here. We said that atoms of a propositional logic, they become unary predicates in the first order logic. So that means that for every atom or atomic predicate, we have a unary relation, which is just like X related to X, right? A thing is related to itself, right? So here, every predicate gets a relation. So we've basically split the world in two, right? We have on the one hand, we have language, and on the other hand, we have this domain or this model that is interpreting or is kind of giving you constraints on what the language is actually talking about. And so the relation is on that other side, right? It's on the structure side right now. So we can talk about here. I don't think we actually need to get into this, but there's different ways we can formulate the relations corresponding to a predicate. We just have to make sure that it obeys certain axioms. So obeys some kind of like constraints here. And then let's define valuations again. So remember, a valuation is a thing that says, let's add true or false to all the atoms. And from that, we're going to get the value of the sentence. We want to do that now. Then we basically have to, there's certain rules we need to apply. Here, we just need to remember the new rule that in order to evaluate a predicate, the terms of that predicate must exist in some relation. So if I want to say that the predicate F is true on Adam, Eve, and Cain, then there must exist a relation on the model side in which Adam, Eve, and Cain is part of that relation. Okay, this is a technical detail that you probably won't need right now, but we can refer back to it if we have questions later. Okay, next step is we want to extend first order logic with functions. Again, it requires 2 steps. If you want to extend your language, you also need to extend your model, like what counts as a model for that language. In this case, we're going to extend it with functions by also adding operations to the other side. So an example would be like 2 + 2 = 4. That's a relation already, 2, 2, 4. But notice that the order matters, right? But that's not always the case. You might want ones where order doesn't matter. Relations are very general in that sense. But instead of doing that, we can define operations, which are basically like, you can think of it as a list of elements on our domain, and they represent the output or the operation, the mapping of the function. So if we say f a function on A and B is equivalent to C, we can have an operation on the other side that groups them together. So you could say, okay, well, this seems just like a relation. It's like very similar. Here, order does matter, right? So the operation, each place is distinct, and it's always the last one that is the output of the function. Okay, so now we have enough to define what a term is. A term is any variable or constant plus the function applied on, or a function applied on terms. So if you give me variables or constants, I can give you another term, which is a function applied on those variables or constants. And then we also enhance our predicates so that they are defined on terms and not just variables. So we can feed in a function into a predicate and get something, right? True or false from it. And then finally, the last step we need to add is sorts or types. So before I said there was a domain, right? There's a set U that contains all the elements of stuff that you're going to pull from in your language. Instead of one domain, let's have many domains, one for every type. So you have a type of people, a type of, animal, a type of, building, right? This is the underlying reasoning for, doing type theory, the underlying machinery you need to do type theory. You need to be able to interpret different types from different individuals, right? Okay, so, and then once you have this idea of a sort, what sort of thing is it? You can attach them to terms. And then predicates and functions can accept certain terms. So they'll say like, I'm a function on numbers only. If I'm a function on numbers, you cannot give me like a general set. I won't work on that. I only work on numbers. And then you can build, more and more complex types from that. Yeah, we had a presentation, I think last year on types. I think that would be a good one to look at to connect this definition to. But yeah, basically they're very useful, right? Like I said earlier, types are one way to avoid Russell's paradox because they create this like firewall around the operations you can do. But yeah, and more generally, they're useful because you can do reasoning over these types. You can form more complicated types over simpler types. And there's even this idea that like at some level types are the same as like propositions, which you can kind of interpret in a category. But well, yeah, we can leave that statement for now. Okay, so we've gotten through a lot already. We've gotten through this idea of propositional logic, first order logic. Now we're ready to talk about what is more interesting, I think, theories and models. A theory is a set of sentences in L called the axioms, right? So the thing we want to work with now, we want to forget everything we just talked about and just say like, let's assume we have a language and set of axioms. That's our theory. And a model is a structure that satisfies the axioms. So remember when we said the definition of satisfies means you have a valuation of the atomic elements or the atomic predicates. If you can evaluate them in such a way that all of your axioms are true, then you found a model that satisfies A. But the nice thing about it is when you satisfy A, you often are satisfying more than just the axioms. You're also finding new statements that are true as a consequence of holding A to be true. Right? So there can be more statements that are true that are inside than what is inside A if you find a model. And that's where all the fun of mathematics is. It's finding these consequences, right? So these consequences are called theorems. They're true in all models. There's a famous theorem by Gödel, which shows that this is basically true. that, you know, you have to find something that's true in all models. And then we can write this using this nice symbol here, that S is a theorem of T. So by definition, T, or your theory, is consistent if you don't get this situation right, that S is a consequence and not S is also a consequence of T. Now with a pair consistent logic, that's, you know, that's not the case. You can do this, but it has to be under certain constraints, right? Certain contained version of this can happen. And then T is complete if all the sentences are either one or the other. So you're either a theorem or you're not a theorem in a complete theory. There's nothing in between, right? But there may be theories that are not complete. Then we'll see an example of one. So an example here would be theory of groups. So we can describe this theory in terms of the following language, right? The operations, we have 1, 2, 3.
Dennis,
Yeah, go ahead, John.
I know you know this, but just for everyone else, in a complete theory, everything is either a theorem or a non-theorem in the sense that it's refutable, right?
Mm-hmm.
In any consistent theory, something is either a theorem or not a theorem. I'm just not sure that that distinction was completely clear in the way that you said it.
Yeah, the way I understand it is complete means everything is either one or the other, and consistent means there's no situation of true and not true for the same sentence. Right? So like an inconsistent, so you can have actually theories that are complete but inconsistent, and you can have,
Yes, obviously.
yeah, inconsistent theories which are complete. So yeah.
Right,
So
but in a complete theory, every sentence is either provable or refutable.
Okay, I see.
And that's not the same thing as every sentence being a theorem or a non-theorem.
Gotcha. Yes.
That's all. I know you know that, but just for everybody else.
Yes, that is important. And I think, yeah, in order to understand that difference between being a theorem and being provable, you'd have to introduce probably a proof system, which I haven't done in this case, but let's just roughly say that in order to say something is provable, you actually you need a concrete line of transformations to your statement in order to show that they match with an axiom. So there is a procedure that you can turn a sentence into one of your axioms or one of the other true statements. And if you can do that, then you've concretely proven that statement to be true. So simply saying something is a theorem doesn't mean that you have that concrete list of steps to transform it into an axiom. Yeah, that's a good point here. So
I'm sorry, would you repeat that last formulation again?
yeah, in order to be provable, you need a concrete list of transformations according to a proof system that turns a sentence S into one of these sentences in your axioms.
Yes.
Yeah.
But that's the standard way of speaking of a theorem.
Right. Right. Whereas what I'm saying here is just like something is true. It means there is a valuation that will make S and T to be true, or T to be true and not S to be true. So this is that difference is important because, you know, Gödel will say that there are statements which are true but not provable, right?
Right. And those are not theorems.
Those are not theorems, right?
All right, I may just be mishearing you as we go, in which case I apologize.
Yeah, no, that was, I think you heard me right. I think that this is a good distinction to make. Okay, so let's continue here. So in the theory of groups, we have these operations, the main one being this like combination group multiplication thing. You have the inverse, you have the identity, and you have equals, you have variables, and you have constants coming from some domain. here, let's say the domain is the rotational symmetries of a Rubik's cube. That would be like that would be a model, right? And it has to satisfy these axioms. So we can skip reading these like literally. We could just say that like if you rotate a Rubik's cube twice in one way, there's also another way you can rotate it twice such that you get to the same spot. So yeah, basically like, oh yeah, sorry, if it doesn't matter what direction or what order that you do it in, I can rotate it, you know, I don't know, in one axis and then in another axis, and I get the same result if I rotate in that second axis and the first axis. So associativity holds. You have identity, and then identity means like you do nothing to the Rubik's cube, and then you have inverses. So whatever move you make, you can do the opposite of that move. And I put this technical note that technically, you know, the moves of a Rubik's cube are not a group, because there's no move that is equal to making two subsequent moves sometimes. So it's more accurate to say not the moves, but the rotational symmetries. So there's a symmetry that's the same, not necessarily like a physical move, but yeah, that's a side note. What's important here in the theory of groups that I wanted to highlight is that the relationship between the theory and the model is here one of like two abstract structures that play off of each other. So this rotational symmetry or whatever, it assigns values to the variables and the constants such that we can make these statements true. So there's a notion here of assigning, right, of what is X, Y, and Z, where do they come from? They come from these symmetries, the set of symmetries. And that valuation makes these axioms hold. They satisfy the axioms. Yeah, I think Gabriel made a good comment here about definitely group theory is extremely interesting. I think it definitely plays a lot of a bigger role than what we use in SDP. It would be nice to go and understand it more. I think it.
Yeah, I was just referring to that guy's course that you found, which is really cool. The Rubik's Cube guy.
Yeah, it's amazing. Oh, so he uses Rubik's cubes to describe it.
Wait, you were the one who showed me this visual group theory fella.
Oh, really? Don't remember
Oh shit. Who? Oh my god, I'm passing gossip around. I'm not sure who showed me this then. It's a really good course, like complete course on group theory, but it only uses the Rubik cube as the example for all types of little symmetries, operations, and so on. It's really, really, really nice.
Oh, nice. Yeah, that's always what I think of too when I think of groups starting out. But yeah, there's definitely some more like crazy complex shapes out there, including topological groups, which are just themselves like spaces. And then you have the operations become like how you move one to the other. Okay. Here's another interesting theory, the theory of Turing machines. I'll kind of go through this quickly because I'm aware we've been here for a while now. Basically, Turing machines, you can also describe them using a language, and then you can have axioms, which I didn't list here. And then, the actual Turing machine, the model that's running on your computer right now, that gives an evaluation, right, to the different variables here. So here we have like a list of states with always having a halt and a start, but you can have other states. Then you have this alphabet, which is basically like some kind of piece of code that you can leave in every memory location. And then you have rules which tell you, given the current state and the current alphabet, how to behave, right? How do you act? And just with this basic setup, you basically describe, all of computation, but specifically you allow us to answer a question about theories, which is this: the decision problem states that given a theory T, there exists an algorithm which tells us if a sentence S is a consequence of T. So this is the thing that John brought up before. The difference between a theorem, which is provable, and just like a true statement of a theory is exactly, do you have an algorithm to give us this, right? Do you have some list of steps to yield that, to tell us if it's decidable? So in this case, we can ask the question, is first order logic itself, meaning all the symbols we gave, like any theory that you make in first order logic, can you decide that? Can you come up with an algorithm to figure that out? And going back to Leibniz and Hilbert, there is this dream that, you could do this you could decide these statements using some kind of computing machine. Gödel came along and said that's not going to happen. And then Church and Turing later on came along with actual concrete examples of undecidable problems. And as a result of this, one of the things that Turing proved is that first order logic is equivalent to a Turing machine, meaning you can take a theory that's built on first order logic. So everything we just talked about, you can construct a Turing machine for any sentence of that theory. And then you can show that, there exists this halting problem, meaning there are some sentences that you cannot decide on, right? You can't show that you can't prove that it's true. So there's this interesting, kind of a reflection, right? From first order logic, you can formulate Turing machines, but once you formulate Turing machines, you can go back and look at first order logic and show that it's there's a concrete way in which it's undecidable. Okay, we're almost at the end here. 3 more slides. The next one is about topology. So we've talked about theories and models and stuff. Let's talk about a specific thing called a topological space. It's a set X called a set of points with another set T called its topology. And we've kind of encountered this before, I think Renzo's presentation, but in other moments we've talked about topological spaces. What makes it special is this set T, which is a subset of the power set of X. So the power set itself is a topology, but that's like kind of the discrete topology is not not usually used. There's other ones, right? But they have to obey these axioms. So if every element of T is an open set, then you have to have both X itself and the empty set. You need to be able to take arbitrary unions, possibly infinite unions, and then you need to be able to support finite intersections. So this just gives you rules. Like if I tell you that a certain subset of X is an open set, then it needs to also, it implies that other open sets exist, potentially, right? Obviously, if I only give you X and the empty set, and I give you some other arbitrary subset, that doesn't imply any new things. But if I give you at least 2 other open sets, then their intersection and their union must also be in here, right? So there's some implication there, right? Then this next statement is maybe more intuitive. So open sets are one way of characterizing topological spaces, but you can also do it through neighborhoods. And neighborhoods are interesting in their own right. So they're basically subsets of X that contain an open set. So even if they themselves are not open sets, they can be closed, for example. If they contain an open set, then they're a neighborhood. And then you can forget open sets entirely and just talk about neighborhoods and define the topology that way. You also have this thing, I think Renzo used it with, also Badu uses it as well, the closure axioms. So instead of defining open sets or neighborhoods, you have this operator on the set X or the power set of X, and yeah, so that there's a way to define it if this operator obeys certain rules. What we care about here is that the Hausdorff spaces are the ones where any 2 points have disjoint neighborhoods. So you need, if for any 2 points, you need to have a neighborhood that contains point 1 and a neighborhood that contains the other point 2, and those 2 neighborhoods cannot overlap, basically. So once we have this definition of Hausdorff spaces, we can move on to the interesting stuff about space and logic. I linked here Yasha's presentation, which has a bit more on this, but this text that I linked on the website, it's basically, I'm covering basically the first 20% of that text here. Essentially, we can take the theories that we've defined previously and we can represent them as an algebra. How do we do that? We take the sentences of the theory and we do a quotient. So earlier we defined what a quotient was, but it's basically like counting things that are the same as the same, right? According to a certain relation. So in this case, the relation will be by implication. So if A is a consequence of B and B is a consequence of A, they are the same under this quotient operation. If we do this, if we create this thing, then we can view a theory as an algebra, where taking 2 sentences and taking their if you think about the rules of formation that we said earlier, we can say like A and B, right? Where A and B are sentences, or A or B, that's also a sentence, right? Those correspond to the Boolean algebra, which that's how we're viewing our theory now. Right, we're viewing it as like all the sentences and the combinations of sentences that you can form using the algebraic rules of Boolean algebra. But this then leads us into an interesting theorem called Stone's representation theorem that tells us that any Boolean algebra corresponds to a Hausdorff space. So if propositional logic, which again is not first order logic, if propositional logic can be formulated as a Boolean algebra and Boolean algebras correspond to Hausdorff spaces, then any propositional logic has a space associated to it. But here, remember that propositional logic is not the same as first order. We don't have predicates yet. And we want to generalize it to something that's not Boolean, right? For STP, we talk about Heiting algebras. Badu uses Heiting algebras. There's an analog of Stone's representation theorem called Isakia's spaces, or Isakia's representation theorem, that does the same thing, right? I think that's an area of research for us, I think, to try to understand this aspect. But in general, we want to hold these things to be true, right? We want to say that for every logical theory, there's an associated space. And this space is comprised of points which correspond to the models of the theory. Remember that a model is basically a valuation of all the atoms of your theory, of your language, such that all your axioms hold true. So if you have a point, then you have something that verifies, basically like makes all your axioms true. So by doing this, we've created these this kind of logical space. Within the logical space, you have open sets, just like in other spaces, but these open sets now correspond to formula. And you can basically think of it as like these formula are true in a restricted sense, right? They may not be true for all models, but only true for a subset of these models, right? So every formula has like its area, let's say its region of this logical space in which it is true. That's how you should think of it for propositional logic. And then if you move up to first order logic, if you add those predicates, then now you have a sheaf instead of just an open set. And then you have continuous maps, which are a continuous map between two spaces now corresponds to transformation of models, but only definable within geometric logic. And then Vickers also says this interesting thing, which I think somewhat clarifies Badiou's approach, right? Vickers says that propositional toposes are localic. So we know from, I believe, Badiou himself says it, but I think there's other commentators who say that, you know, Badiou uses only localic toposes. We can now say with the Vickers text that this means that he's able to formalize propositional logic only. But if you want to go to predicate logic, you need something that's stronger than localic toposes. I could be wrong about that, but that's kind of how I read this portion. And also here's a link to the NCAT lab, kind of talks about the same issue. Okay, so then that leads the question, you know, is the localic topos enough? You know, what is the trade-off if we go from this to some other kind of topos? Like, are we losing something in formulating this kind of stuff? And then the last slide here, I wanted to talk about how this fits together with like the monster diagram. So when you have an algebra, when you have two algebras, you can define a homomorphism between them. So that basically takes elements to each other respecting the algebraic rules, right? In particular, when we talk about the Lindenbaum algebra, we're talking about the sentences which have been collapsed into the ones that are bi-implicative, right? So once we've collapsed them into this algebra, when we come up with a homomorphism, then we're basically taking sentences of one theory to the sentences of another. And this gives us something very interesting, right? I'll jump straight down here, which is to say that if we have a geometric morphism G that takes sentences to sentences and preserves theoremhood, then G gives rise to another operation or another morphism called, here we'll call it G star, that takes the models of the codomain theory into the models of the domain theory. So notice that it's contravariant, right? In G, T is the domain, and then T prime is the codomain. In this special one, it's the opposite, right? The models of T prime are transformed into the models of T. This A is the space or the algebra that you're working with. So here it's like it could be, if it's 2, then you have a stone space or a Hausdorff, right? It's a 2-element space. But more generally, A is just some algebra. So it could be a hiding algebra, for example, or a Breuer algebra. So remember that we said previously that every model is a point. Every model is a point. So over here, what we're saying that if you have the set of all models, then you have this general space, right? So general space of models here are mapped to the general space of models here. Once we have this idea, then we can talk about a category in which propositional theories are the objects, and the maps between them are these geometric morphisms that have, these properties. But so far, there's some technical details, like we've been talking about essentially like stone spaces, or we've been talking about these simpler logics. In order to get to geometric logic, you have to generalize from stone spaces to locales. So they're no longer these Hausdorff spaces. They're not even really topological spaces. They're more general than topological spaces because they don't have points everywhere. But they do have open subregions. So then, yeah, they suggest points, right? This is kind of an interesting idea. The way I interpret this right now is to say that the types, if you have like a typed language, that not every type necessarily has like something that corresponds to that type. So the consequence of this would be if it would be breaking away from Badiou's thesis on materialism, right? That every atom is real. I think in geometric logic, more generally, not every atom is real. But I'd have to, we need to do more research on that. I'm not 100%. That's just my like phantasmagoric imagination when I read this statement. Okay. So I think we're at the
just
end.
before we move on this, perhaps you can comment on it, because I think that there is this thing. You're not there yet, but I think you might be presupposing this as you move. If I understand correctly, there is a difference between a locale as this restricted space that you have this correspondence with propositional logic, and a localic topos, which is the sheaves on a locale, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you have the locale is in Badiou's construction is just like the transcendental stuff, whereas like when you get to the end of the atomic logic, you're actually in a localic topos. So you do get like the transcendental functor, and you do get the sheaving, and like you do more than just, you can do first order logic in that space.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I think that the restriction that he puts, that I don't know where it's coming in here, and that people complain, is that by keeping it a localic topos, you're still keeping this constraint, which is that map onto set, right? Which means there must be, from your pointless topology, from this geometric logic crazy space, you still are obliging every open set you have as a proposition, it should correspond to some point, to some element somewhere, right? There is an extensional interpretation for every atomic formula, right?
Yeah.
Like
yeah,
that's not,
yeah,
like I think that those are three things. Like locales imply that we want our logic to correspond to the structure of a topology of open sets. That's locales Heyting algebra. Then we want to glue parts of a domain in such a way that these are like the category of sheaves on a locale. So that will make it into a topos with all the cool stuff that Topos has, but it's still localic because we're using that basic starting point still to structure these sheaves, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then you enrich it. Now we moved from propositional logic to first order logic, And then Badiou is saying like, yeah, I want to keep the postulate of materialism is saying, yeah, let's not get lost on the fact that you can make, you know, you can generate atomic propositions at will in a certain way, because I'm still keeping the condition that there must be an extensional counterpart to these things, right?
Yeah.
That's I think why people complain that it's like an elementary topos with like every localic topos is a Grothendieck topos, so it is a rich, it is a universe, right? But it's constrained in that way, and I'm not sure where that constraint, which ultimately makes all of this into a logical, like a richer interpretation of set theory, right? Where that constraint is appearing in this construction, it might not have come in yet, right? Extensional means that you can, when I say something like this blob of blue, this blob here in a painting is blue, that you want to be able not to, let's say, just define this open fuzzy region. There's something in that domain that where the proposition is true, that extensionally you can pick as an element, which is the blue you're talking about, right? Extensional means you can find a set, right, that has that property. It is not just intentionally described by these logical interrelations. So yeah, exactly. You get back to a notion of equality that is natural to set theory. To me, that's one of the most profound ideas that he has. But yeah, I just wanted to bring this in because like I get lost somewhere in the transition between locales. Yeah, no, it's the same. Yeah, exactly. I get lost between locales, localic toposes, and where the condition that he's putting, you know, of these set-based interpretation to atomic proposition, where it is coming in this description. Like I'm not sure if it's would be further ahead or if it's further behind, you know, where you are right now.
Yeah, I am also confused. I think the way that Vickers uses locales is different from what we, because yeah, I also thought of sheaves as being built on top of locales, right? Locales are just the base space of a sheaf. But I think in the Vickers text, a locale is like a competing space to a topos.
Yeah, that's why I got confused, because on page right early on they say like forcing the language, we could call these locales, like, you know, proposition toposes are called localic, or with a slight abuse of language, locales, because it's a slightly abuse of language, because I think locales are not toposes yet.
Yeah, in this theorem 1.71, they say that there is an equivalence between locale maps and topos maps in the case of propositional theories. And propositional theories, from what I understand, there are theories without types. So if you have a theory that doesn't have any types, then locales and toposes function the same way, maybe? I don't know. So I don't know. Yeah, there's something there. The way that Vickers has used it, yeah, there's an abusive notation, like you were saying.
Yeah, because I mean,
later on we get to predicate logic, like
yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, the way we're using Badiou's work, it's, I mean, you know, you can see the difference, and everyone who read with us Logics of Worlds, we all felt that there was a jump between what he calls function of appearing and what he calls phenomenal component, because it's just a different topic, right? We were talking about those evaluations of nearness and distance in like open set pointless topology, and suddenly he entered with these component structures, and we found that it's much easier to interpret what's going on there if you realize he's starting to talk about predicates, right?
Yeah.
And it is the introduction to what will be the sheaf logic section. So these things are part of what he's doing there. And it's all about recuperating, right? The sort of correspondence between logic and topology after you introduce the predicates. That's why the whole complication with the transcendental functor, because it's not easy to show that, you know, you can recuperate the actual structure out of the just the interplay of predicates, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it makes sense. Like you should be able to have predicates in Badu, right? That doesn't seem like too much of a thing. I think here this sentence is important. These propositional toposes are called localic or locales, and they're equivalent to these ones. So basically, a locale, the way that Vickers is using it, is a type of topos. It's a propositional topos. Yeah. Or in other words, localic toposes are locales for him.
Yeah, I know that on, for example, NLab will make the distinction in saying that a category is a localic topos if it is equivalent to the category of sheaves on a locale.
Okay, I see.
Yeah, but yeah, it just sounds like nobody, like it's not just us who are confused. It is like there is a bit of a fluctuation of the vocabulary, right?
Yeah. Yeah, there's fluctuation here. So yeah, it's something we should look at. So I'm not sure when this jump happens between localic to like toposes in general. And then I think that's related to a lot of critiques of Badu and exactly this issue that you brought up about like the definition of an extensional equivalent or an extensional interpretation of the predicates. Yeah, the critique of Badu, and from the chat here, the critique of Badu is that two mistakes of Badu. I forget the name.
Yeah, it's a text by Antti Veilahati, but it's I don't like it very much though. Because what they call a mistake is that they think it's arbitrary that he restricts his. Yeah, I'll just post you the text here. Just one second. It's this one. Yeah, their point is that he restricts the account of to the account of local topos theory, and that for them this is too arbitrary, not justified, and this is also mentioned by another author, Tasic. Really nice paper, math, metaphor, and almost everything. It's a bit less gratuitously polemical, but also touches on this topic.
Another thing we know that he doesn't use a many sorted system, right? He doesn't have types. Or doesn't consider sorts. So that's
No.
another aspect, right? Whereas I think Vickers seems to associate geometric theories with many sorted languages.
Yeah, I mean, just to I mean, I'm not sure how much more you were thinking of going because it's already quite late, but just on this particular point, since we brought it up, I think it's important to realize also that I think this plays, I mean, I don't think this is relevant, really relevant, but just because we mentioned Badiou, I think that something that it's common in the critique that the mathematicians make of this project, because often mathematicians are not interested in the project, just in the mathematics. They therefore don't care if there are restrictions which are not arbitrary, but come from other commitments. And it just ties back to what we were talking about, metapolitics, politics, and so on. The fact that theories are not able to express very much, the fact that, let's say, ZFC can be divided between the things it manages to express, the things it does not manage to express, and the things that it manages not to express. Those are three different things. There are a bunch of statements you can derive and things you can construct. There are things the theory is impotent to do, and there are things that the theory manages to avoid saying, right? And that indetermination is interesting to somebody who's trying to stay at the metapolitical level, in the sense of, I want to be able to make determinate statements, but I don't want to make over-determining statements. If I say something like every collective takes this form, that's useless. It's good to be in a theory that is weak when you're trying to construct a certain level of generality, right? And what for a mathematician sounds like a weakness in the sense of, yeah, but you could say more if you adopted, hypersets, or if you, went and explored the full power of what category theory can do, or whatever like this, and then looked for philosophies that have something to do with that. You can do that, but that's just going over the fact that this particular guy has commitments that amongst them, you want to keep things open because it's not in your turf as a philosopher, as somebody who's interested in, discussing things in a very general level, to say beforehand how things should be. So from that particular pragmatic standpoint, things that might look like restrictions or, let's say, weaker systems might actually make it fit even better what you want to do, right? So I think that that's also part of what makes Badiou's project sometimes counterintuitive to some of the mathematical critiques, which is, why doesn't he say more, or why isn't he interested in something stronger? And usually people get trapped in these two arguments, which make no sense if you know his project a bit. It has nothing to do with foundations, has nothing to do with the idea that everything is made up of sets, and it has nothing to do with the fact that, he's looking for the best way to say everything about everything. It's a much finer pragmatic point of finding the theory that is weak in the correct way, right? In order to keep the other commitments that you have. I think that's kind of a weird place. Of course, we don't have time to go there, but it's an interesting thing to see that, for Badiou to say, yes, you need to have an extensional counterpart or extensional interpretation to your logical spaces, also means that you're subjected ultimately to finding out if there is stuff out there that actually refers to things. Yeah, I don't see how that relates to Kant. Like, in which sense, Anna? Like, it's not like he's saying you cannot say something. You can very well say things. It's just that, is it politically interesting if you're a Maoist to say these things rather than let people decide on the go if that's what they want to say? Or is it interesting as somebody committed to, scientific creation, to anticipate whatever it is that is true about how things should be formulated, right?
Yeah, I don't have much energy left to keep going, but wanted to briefly just show this demo I came up with. So I've been working on this thing to try to make Topos theory more intuitive. And the way it works is you bring in some visual thing like a painting. And I have a search bar that will let you pull in different paintings. But right now, this is like a Kandinsky thing that I found online. It has a lot of colors, and you can add different filters, right? Much like in Photoshop or anything, you can define a filter by choosing a subset of the color space, right? The color space is convenient because it's a three-dimensional, not a four-dimensional thing. Actually, if you include alpha, it would be four-dimensional, but in this case, you can represent it as a three-dimensional object. So we can see the interaction between space and logic more clearly here. So by choosing like a subset of this, let me do this. Let me try to isolate specifically the blue. So if I close these things, so you see that I've like reduced my cube down to blue colors only. If I activate this, we'll see a filter on this space. And the intuition I wanted to capture here is that this filter is one way of looking at the painting, but it's also tied specifically to a part of the painting, which is this blue region here. Or maybe you can say it's some other region, right? But you can say like there is a region that exists of this painting that is maximal or most adequately expressed by this subset of the color space. And likewise, you can, if I deactivate this now, you could say that there is a color red on this painting that corresponds to some portion of the color spaces as well. So if I eliminate blue and green and I only keep red and I add that as well, we can deactivate this and see red here, right? So these correspond to atoms, or what we called atomic predicates in the presentation, but in Badu, they're atoms more generally, like they're predicates, and they range over this domain, the domain being the painting. Yeah, some things are left in, some things are left out, right? So if we think of this idea that every atom is a filter plus a part of the domain, so that's like this part of the painting here that's illuminated by the red, then yeah, we have this interesting intuition for how these things interact together. For example, you can take two atoms and localize one on the other, which means finding the way that the color space, the way that an atom would behave if it were restricted to a subset of the color space. So clearly, like the red and the blue, if you were to localize one on the other, you would get nothing because they're independent, right? But if you were to localize like a blue cube on a smaller blue cube, you would get a different atom that would have some of the shades of blue of the previous atom, but it would be limited. So you give the nice intuition for localization, for gluing. You can glue atoms together, right? And in some sense, the the whole painting is revealed, stepwise as you glue these filters together. So that's basically what I wanted to get to. I think I'm a bit tired from all of this logic stuff, so maybe next time we can, in a different meeting, we can talk about this. I'm still working on it.
That's really beautiful, though. I would like to see where this goes.
Yeah.
What's the name of that app that you're using?
The app, yeah, I built this using like shaders and this library called 3JS.
It's really cool. I mean, this whole thing is so cool. I like don't even know how to like say how much I'm appreciating it, but thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm excited to work on this more. I think it would be really good to like discuss this with the group and try to use this as like a playground for studying toposes, or at least some version of a topos.
Yeah, man, I also think that this presentation, like you ended up creating two really good preambles for future discussions, because we can refer to the first part of the conversation to continue a debate on, how to kind of, I'm not sure if systematize the word, but like how to list and kind of treat some of the statements we've made as STP thus far, and how they might relate to, like these bigger challenges of finding some formal grounding to it, something like that. But the second part also became a really good kind of database of stuff that's useful to go over, even if you Wikipedia it, even if you just watch some YouTube videos, if you want to get a kind of underlying backstage kind of picture of the machinery on the things we've been talking about.
Yeah.
So I think that we can also a lot of presentations can build on top of this one, and it might be good that some of the stuff on your automated topos theory filtering device is allowed to have a presentation of its own and a discussion of its own, where we can just refer people to what you showed today as a kind of the scaffolding you need to kind of look at, I guess.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. I think the demo, this demo, it doesn't really tell you much, like it doesn't really walk you through what you're looking at. I mean, everyone knows about color filters, right, from Photoshop and so on. So yeah, in order to really make this come alive as like a demo, I need to incorporate ideas from this presentation, but I also need this to inform the presentation. Like what exactly are we doing when we're creating these filters? Yeah, so I definitely think it's a starting point for more research. But yeah, then also when you're talking about the machinery, I think this is like kind of the machine I'm trying to describe here.
Yeah, it reminded me a bit of the other little idea we had for describing these things from a meeting where we made a distinction between like formalisms, the kind of political theories we've been using, and like Badiou's categories, and how we're trying to track these three things.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they interact in different ways, and they're not necessarily fully accounting for one. One is not necessarily the equivalent of the other, right? They're almost like different parallel projects.
Yeah. My take these days is that I need to go as well, but just I feel like a good way of approaching this is to see that there is something like a sense of a way of formulating very large speculative concepts that preserve something which is of interest to preserve in terms of, let's say, what must be solved politically, must be solved in a situated way. And this way that Badiou constructs, for example, the idea of transcendental, of worlds, it seems to preserve that. But we're not interested in having such a general discussion. So we found, let's say, slightly more specific counterparts within social political theories that seem to potentially also be able to say things about the social political world while preserving a good dose of indetermination for what concrete political processes can be. And these have been things like Bogdanov's theory of organization, Karatani's theory of modes, like things that can express a lot of different things while still being quite determined, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the big challenge is, how do you know Bogdanov has anything to do with Karatani, which has anything to do with world systems theory, which has anything to do with value theory or whatever, like other than synonymy between words, right? And that's where the formalism again comes as, well, if you can translate these different things into operations and statements in a common grammar, the chances that we can show that we're speaking about the same things is, increases. So I think that that's also another way of seeing it. Like, again, that's why we're not, let's say, doing Badiouian philosophy. We're not extending his broad concepts, but we did use them to find other theories which are of interest. And the question is, how do you bind these other theories? And that's also where, again, the formalism seems to help, because if you don't find a common ground to translate and you just trust that because two authors use the word value, or two people agreed on an interpretation of Marx, that's enough consistency, you never know if you're building or gluing these things in a way that has a minimal consistency, right? And that you can make new statements. Whereas if we translate them, right? It's a way of thinking about this scaffolding you constructed, not as a accumulation, but like, it's almost like they're free floating on top of each other until you can translate into something that has a strict scaffolding. And then they're touching,
Yeah.
Logics of world technology, world systems, capital. It's not that one follows from the other, but you can never be really sure that you're connecting these things, because it can just be in your head like an interpretation. But if you can find a grammar that's just one theory, where all of them can lead you to make statements that have some level of integration and concatenation amongst them, then the chance that these things are integrated or intrinsically related, it increases, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's exactly the key. It's not that one theory encompasses the other. It's that there are certain trajectories that we've already taken through these different works, and we've kind of trusted that we were making jumps from one to the other, like successfully going from Karatani to Marx, just by, our own understanding. But yeah, I think there's some work to be done in like building a bridge there that it might enable more to happen in that intersection.
Yeah, I think that this is always this is also the difference between translation and, like, in a quicker sense, and this modelization which you get when you translate into something slightly more formal. Because what you do get usually is that you get a lot of new productive statements for free. Like if I tell you, like, this is the weird thing. Like if you translate from Portuguese, like from English, like, the book is on the table, to Portuguese, o livro está na mesa. Generally, one sentence becomes one sentence. But when you translate theory into this common grammar of a bit more formal punch, usually like one statement becomes like 10 statements. And 9 of them, and actually the 10 of them you didn't know before. And when you try to retranslate them into politics, now you have 10 statements rather than just the big one, So I think that mismatch between how many words you need to say something in a philosophy or political philosophy book, and how many words you need to say something when you try to put it in this quasi-formal grammar, it's a mismatch that works to our advantage, because you end up having to take many more steps between statements, and all those smaller steps, they might turn out to be interesting statements in their own right that lead our political intuition in new places, you know.
Mhm.
I think that's also where this is the crucial thing. Nobody's interested in the authority of the formalized statement. That doesn't do anything for us. It actually would be very alienating. But the fact that to claim something like, yeah, a lot of people speak about politics differently, like to try to turn that into a minimally kind of integrated statement into other statements we already have tried to formalize a bit. It takes so many steps that you'll end up saying a lot of new things that are interesting for politics as well. Like you get things for free, right? Because you can derive, or because you are obliged to make certain steps.
Yeah.
That mismatch of how constraints are in between these two things you're connecting. I think we should invert, like natural language translation that should use modeling as a metaphor, and not we should use translation like in literature as a metaphor for the day you translate like a 10-page poem in a 500-page poem in another language, then I'll believe translation, like, you know, it's that rich a metaphor.
Yeah. I think there's also the question of just like you were saying, I think it builds a certain humility on the one hand, but also it gives us a sense of the cost of our statements. Like if a statement that is just one sentence in our language, if we unpacked it and turned it to 100 sentences in some formal language, that kind of means we're kind of trusting a lot of like intuition has already happened on the side of the listener, and that, you know, we're kind of asking the listener to pay this big price in order to understand what we're saying. I think there might be more incremental statements we can make that take less, like cost less to other people. So, you know, we basically make more humble steps towards the metapolitical statements, so that you know, we're not always just like throwing bombastic statements out there. We're actually building, like, you know, like a path that you can take. You know, like if you accept this statement, then maybe you'll accept this next statement, and if you accept that statement, maybe you'll accept the next one. You know, incrementally. And you know, I think it's important to have that sense of the cost of the statement. Obviously there's like there's a formal cost that is associated to every statement, but there's also like this political cost that we were talking about at the beginning, which is like, you know, what does it mean to accept that statement for your organizing practice, or, you know, your political work. That's different. But I think those two costs may be related, because if it takes 100 statements to say what one statement says, like you know, you're assuming a lot, I think, of the people around you.
So something I think would be really helpful to pursue further in connection with this conversation, I'm really interested in that essay about Topos theoretic bridges by Olivia Caramello, and the distinction she makes specifically between like what she calls like you know, construction versus generalization. Because I think that there are a lot of like, I mean, it's a relatively specific, like sort of, you know, formally approached problem in her case. It's not such a simple, you know, intuitive thing in the naive sense. But I do think it's sort of interesting to try to trace out, I guess, a little bit that like some of the barriers there in terms of like, to what extent is, say, the formal vocabulary that reduces the amount of words that you need to express something? To what extent is that like kind of like a generalization that also kind of, I guess, limits some of the constructive potential? To what extent is that something that you can use to sort of, you know, generate new constructions? And like, is there some kind of way to like evaluate that even like on a formal level, which I think is part of what Caramello's project seems to be about to me? Which I need to like put a little bit more work into understanding the nuts and bolts of. But I am really interested in that connection with like, you know, what this sort of like giant monster of of a project that SDP is developing, like, is there a way that we can, I think, connected to some of those concepts as well when we think about like not even necessarily directly the translation metaphor, although of course that's one that like Carmelo relies on. But even just sort of like this question of like, you know, what is like the relation between metapolitics and politics, not just that like we are going in like thinking about, but like what do we actually learn about that relation in the process of trying to like refine the theoretical work that we're doing.
Yeah, both of those are important points. Yeah, I agree though with the first point too, is like having a concise language is maybe not always the best thing. Maybe having, you know, like it's not like formalism because it's more concise is gonna have more effects than like ordinary language. In fact, it's probably the opposite, right? And also the fact that you can compress a lot of stuff into like a poem or, you know, poetic language, you know, that's actually like a feature, not a bug of that type of expression. So yeah, definitely there's some experimentation there. There's like no easy way to evaluate the effectiveness or the cost of some of these statements. John, yeah.
This is just to seize on one moment from early in the presentation and to ask to put a bookmark on it. I think it might be interesting to come back later to the relation between FOL and a system with the power of a Turing machine in order to distinguish explicitly between undecidability as in FOL and incompleteness as in a theory with power of a Turing machine. And I don't mean that to be only a mathematical point. I think the puzzle that's raised there is politically relevant and in some way goes back to the question that you began with about what it is to have consequences. It seems to me, so the puzzle there, right, is how is it possible that FOL per se can be undecidable but complete? Those don't seem to go together, right? And the trick is simply that undecidability is a question asked about FOL reflectively from the outside, that FOL is not in general capable of formulating internally. So FOL is incapable of the internal reflection that would get us to incompleteness. And the reason that I think this makes a rather strong political difference is that I think of politics that can recognize undecidability does not necessarily get beyond quietism, whereas a politics that can recognize incompleteness, which is to say the equivalence of the undecidability of something like the Gödel sentence with its truth, is a politics that's open to a concept of truth. Obviously, I'm kind of on Badgie's side there, but in a metalogical way.
Yeah, this is definitely a fascinating area that I think I'm definitely looking forward to your presentation, John. If you're going to talk about anything like this, yeah, I don't think I have much to add because I'm out of my depth with regards to the technical aspects. But yeah, like you said, it's not only a technical question, right? It's has to do with like, you know, I think what it has to do is like extending the theory T, which is ultimately like, you know, basing statements. It has everything to do with what Anna said also, like we can make new statements if we hold certain things true. And you know, the axiomatic method doesn't require you to you know, have one set of axioms to discover everything, right? You can build different axiom systems and then investigate what statements can be made, what models there exist. And yeah, that's how I understand what you're saying. It's almost like a whole landscape of possible axiom systems and with each one, you have these statements that are not provable, but they exist. And so for like politics, based on that, you can take a statement that is not provable but is true, and you can add that to your theory, which seems like a really nice metaphor, from Badiou and so on. It's a nice metaphor for what politics does to groups of people, right? It allows you to adjoin new statements to that thinking. So my dream is to take that and whatever vague thing I just said and like try to make that rigorous, and then attach that to like the metapolitical theses, right? Because if politics thinks and thought is a relation of the real, what is this other thing, this like extension property that we're talking about, that when you extend a theory, how does that translate into what Lazarou is saying here?
Yeah, a much longer conversation to be had about that.
So something also in response to John's question and like highlighting that particular issue. I'm also very interested in this. And like, of course, it's also like a lot of like what Livingston has worked on, which like I'm interested in that. But a particular thing I've kind of been quietly obsessing over, which might end up, if people are interested in it and I can formulate it well enough in a way that connects even specifically to the formalism, which it might. Like I might want to end up doing something with this, but there's this I forget exactly what her title is, but anyway, there's this theorist named Beatrice Fazzi who works on computation, and she's done some interesting stuff on like, the halting problem specifically, that created some controversy about like what, different ways to, oh my gosh, sorry, different ways to interpret the halting problem. And like, I don't know, I think that this sort of from like a different, maybe more like technical angle gets at a lot of these sort of broader like conceptual questions, and also makes me kind of curious about the extent to which like we can connect or compare a sort of theoretical apparatus or like a metapolitical apparatus to like what, the kind of thing that gets developed in a computational or like, sort of cybernetically like implemented process. So I don't know, I just want to mention that in case it's something that people are interested in. I'll like try to think about ways to communicate better, like what specifically the controversy was about, but I've just been kind of interested in that.
Yeah, sounds like we should form another subgroup to talk about this kind of stuff. But yeah, I'm glad that this presentation was worth everyone's time at least, and then that it kind of sparked some of these conversations. I think we can stop here, right?
Thanks so much, Dennis. This is wonderful.
Yep. Thank you all for staying. Hope you all have a great rest of your night. I think Gabriel left, so I'll just I'll message him.
No, I came back just to close it. I had my hand up. Okay. See you guys.
All right,
Thank you, man.
Bye.